the symposium on architecture research, which is it's more of a informal conversation. Uh, so it's, I mean, just before I begin, I want to sort of introduce the the institution that sort of organized it. So this symposium is organized by C City. Uh, C City is an institutional extension of the school. Uh, so it started in 2014, and since then, it's organized different kinds of roundtables, symposiums, seminars, lecture series. The idea was to have this institutional extension as a platform for dialogue around some of the important questions today. So what we're working with today is on the question of architecture research, right? And hence the title, to experiment in present, uh, a conversation around architecture research. Right? It's also partially funded by Urban Center Mumbai. Its Urban Center was started in 2020, has been an important institutional node for dialogue, for research, and for ideation, particularly around questions of sustainable urban development. So they've partially been funding the symposium and the undergraduate research seminar that's going on parallel to the symposium. So I'll actually sort of start off with just to introduce some of the sort of set a premise for the symposium today. So as many of you know here that there is an undergraduate research thesis symposium that is going on, and last semester or this semester I was actually teaching the research methods course for the thesis students. Right? And we've over the past decade or so come to an understanding that space is not a physical cartographic entity, that we sort of arrived, or sort of, that's become a way of understanding space, right? And rightfully so. That it's socially produced, all forms of relationships of class, caste, gender, of capital are, are spatial in nature, right? But also that space has its own kind of social agency that affects these relationships. Right? But as we look for sources to study them as architects, right? And this was one of the trouble that I had with the course itself is, where do we look for sources to ask these questions about spatialities of relations? Right? And so largely we've relied on or looked for sources, particularly in other disciplines, relied on quantitative and qualitative methodologies, or looked at literary techniques, right? Particularly like like the technique of deconstruction, or looked, or there's particularly in architecture practice, the research methods revolve around questions of design and project management, right? But we're thinking about the idea of actually thinking and researching architecture, right? Where do we look for sources, right? As we dwell deeper into questions of space, particularly as architects, right? What are our sources, right? And so one of the things is to open up this, idea of where do we look for sources of architecture research methodologies as well as methods. And the idea is not to sort of come to any kind of conclusion, but it's an informal conversation. So the idea is to actually, what do we experiment with, right? And hence the title, to experiment in the present. Now this present is not just the specific time and place or space that surrounds us where we are at the moment, right? And there is a certain specificity to this time and space that surrounds us, particularly in terms of the exasperation of violence and difference, the expansiveness of capitalist systems and its ways of thinking, particularly when we're talking about housing, right? The ongoing climate change and health crisis, but also sort of erasure of what you know, otherwise we thought of as were security systems and security blankets for a large majority of people, right? So that's sort of what the present is about, right? But it's also not a present that is frozen. So it's, you know, the present is sort of a duration that extends into the past, but also across geographies, right? So this present is also extending, you know, back into questions of colonialism, questions of colonial ways of thinking, that sort of spans not just in India, but across the world, right? So we're thinking, or rather sort of carrying the burden, but also struggling with this burden of histories of architecture and architecture theory that we've received, right? All its programs and manifestos, its methods of thinking and drawing space. So how do we respond to it, or do we, you know, sort of just free ourselves from this burden as architects, particularly located in a post-colonial context of South Asia, right? So I just, you know, both the abstract, but also just wanted to sort of, you know, lay out a few questions to guide the conversation, right? So one is, how do we locate and position ourselves as architects today, right? Excuse me. What do we pay attention to and how? Right? So how do we, or how do we work with uh, and beyond the research methodologies that are drawn from other disciplines and fields? What are the devices of engagement and representation that are available to us today, right? And then if we are to invent, right, what does inventing new spatial methodologies for architectural research involve? So these are just some of the guiding questions or some of the provocations. Uh, and we have 6 speakers who will open them up based on their own works, experiences, their own pursuits, right, in many different ways. So we have 6, I would say, conversationists for today. First is, I'll just introduce them very briefly. Prasad Shetty, who's an artist, architect, and urbanist. He's also the dean and one of the founders and trustees of C. So he's been working on a range of issues which include, you know, questions around legalities of property, on politics of urban housing and housing policies, on emerging urbanisms in different Indian cities, and more recently on architectural pedagogy in India. Secondly, we have Anuradha Chatterjee, who's a professor and dean at the School of Design and Innovation at RV University in Bangalore. So she's both a practitioner, but also an academic who's been writing and researching on critical pedagogies in architecture, on sort of, you know, rereading or a more grounded feminist reading of architecture theory and history in Asia, and also researching on practices of resilience and decolonization. Uh, Thirdly, we have Rupali Gupte, uh, who's an architect, artist, and an urbanist, as well as the director, founder, and trustee of C. I mean, you know, these are people who come with a range of work in different range of research areas. So Rupali too has been working in a range of research areas, which include urban housing, you know, emerging urbanisms in different cities, on gender and architecture, on amphibious architecture, and more recently on archiving and theorizing architecture and urbanism from within South Asia. Uh, Thirdly, we have fourth. Fourth, we have Kush Patel. Kush is an architect and a pedagogue who teaches at the Shrishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design, and Technology in Bangalore. at Srishti. He also heads the postgraduate arts program in technology and change, and stewards the Just Future Co-Lab. Uh, he's been teaching and researching around questions of critical digital humanities, and on histories and futurities of space, while being grounded within intersectional feminist and queer epistemologies. Uh, Fifth, we have Vishwanath Kashikar. Vishwanath is an associate professor at CEPT University, Ahmedabad. He too comes with experience both in practice as well as teaching. He's been working particularly in question around research areas of urban housing and time-based architecture, and its work particularly pays attention to questions of temporalities of space, flexibilities of space, and change, both in urban housing, but also modern architectural built forms. And lastly, we have Rohit Muzumdar, who's an architect and urbanist who teaches at C. He too has been working on a range of issues, particularly around questions of urbanization, with a focus on urban peripheries. So his work has focused on political economy of land, on economic production, on questions of heritage and environment. And more recently, he's been working on questions of wetness, property tenures, and ongoing architectural transformation within this larger context of climate change. So we have a range of scholars, academic practitioners, who've been engaging in different areas across a diverse set of geographical contexts. So, they all come with different kinds of experiences, but also means that they come with different kinds of questions and provocations from their work. So it'll be, the format is very simple. So each of them will, speak, raise questions, provocations for 10 minutes, and it'll be followed up by open-ended sort of a conversation, which is open to everyone, right, around the kind of questions that seem to be arising, or the kind of themes that seem to be arising. So we'll go in that order. We'll start with Prasad, and then Anuradha, then Rupali, Kush, Vishwanath, and Rohit. So I'll ask Prasad to start us off.
Thanks, Prasad. And so we didn't introduce Prasad. So Prasad Khanalkar recently joined C, and he's been a long-term friend now, and I think has a similar kind of suspicious with managerial and logistical systems that appear to be running cities, and has a tremendous trust and belief in the logics of life and ways in which human beings kind of come together to make habitations and cities and societies. So what I'll do is make broadly 3 points, and from the first one from a research which is almost complete now, but it's kind of still not published or produced as a publication. It's almost complete, and it's on the educational ecosystem for architecture in India. It's a large scale kind of a study undertaken, review of syllabi of some 200 universities across the country, and a deep dive study of some 15 architectural institutions, and many things. So I'll kind of sketch out some points which were the findings from that study. Second is to to speak about the idea of academic space, uh, which I want to distinguish from educational space, because I think that's something which we all need to kind of, because this is a group of very serious academics, as from, I mean, who've been thinking about architectural education for some time now, and I think that's where the focus of the panel is. And third, uh, some institutional possibilities on reorienting uh, academia into a research orientation. You know, so these are the three parts I'm going to talk about. So, so I mean, uh, in the research that we did on architecture education, we kind of closed it recently, and the like everybody does, you know, the first chapter, the introduction, was written after the first year admissions got over this year, and it was interesting to see that the substantial decline uh, in the number of applicants to architectural education, you know, in this year. It was interesting to see a huge decline. And in Maharashtra, we kind of we faced another problem, because these admissions were centrally organized, and they have those some bureaucratic imperatives which makes things more difficult for us. So it was, and many schools, even in Bombay, for example, are running with less than half the number of seats filled. So it's quite a telling situation. A couple of years ago, the High Court of the Supreme Court of India uh, interpreted the Architects Act uh, to to conclude that you do not need an architect to make a building, you know, or even design it. An architect is somebody who simply registered with the Council of Architecture. So that whole throne which architects were occupying, you know, that kind of crumbled, literally. And of course, the Council of Architecture has kind of pleaded again, and then there is a ongoing discussion and an appeal going on, and all of those things. Uh, we did a series of you know, surveys and studies. One of the first kind of starting points of this study was that 90%, more than 90% of this country, its population, does not get services from trained architects, you know, architects with architectural degrees, for their habitation, for their houses, so to say. They don't get served. And even when they, you know, even when they kind of, even when, even in case of 5%, when trained architects do work for housing and habitation, they work through developers. So you really don't know who is the user of your building, etc., etc., etc. And if you see very closely, whenever architects are making houses, you know, very seriously, I mean, large number of architects, they do private homes, and you know, and this is the I mean, there are we have basically the evidence that we are looking at is, you know, uh, general housing census from 2011, as well as, you know, because there is no comprehensive data on architectural production. So we're looking at various kinds of archives of journals and magazines and what they have been publishing and a variety of things. We also kind of interviewed through y'all and through others some 100 architectural firms across the country. We also spoke to more than 100 graduates and graduating students, and interestingly found that, you know, while architectural offices keep complaining about the capacities that are that that are uh, of architects, you know, students, fresh graduates, they're unable to articulate as to exactly what capacity do they want. You know, when you push to articulate, then they say that software, some construction, you know, so this is the articulation they make. What do offices want? They really kind of, you know, struggle to articulate exactly what do they want. uh, there are also enough evidences of that, you know, uh, as compared to the other professional disciplines, so to say, the the remuneration received by architects for the first 3 years, 5 years is much lesser. It's much lesser, and interns somewhere between 2,000 to 8,000, and fresh graduates somewhere between 15,000 to 25,000. 25,000 is very high. 15,000, 20,000 in for the first 3 years. Uh, we also found that most from this kind of broad survey, that that the 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 heads of these firms are usually men, and usually not from the lower castes or outcasts. They're usually from upper castes. Uh, when women participate, they participate with husbands as partners. So it's kind of it's also male dominated, and uh, so so this is and we asked also parents who were coming, you know, for admissions. And that time we asked, were they applying for some other places? So they said वहाँ scope अच्छा है, आजकल आजकल scope अच्छा है, architecture का scope कम है. So this is a kind of this is a sketch of the of so to say the marketplace. So on one hand, 90% of people do not get service, and secondly, your the architects have a serious crisis in terms of professional practice. Okay, so this is a kind of a thing that's going on. The last point here is that many students kind of, across schools say that the way you get your first projects is not based on how good a designer you are. It is based on where you grow up, what are your networks, what are your uh, what friendships you have, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of them are working in offices, struggling to kind of, so there are these kind of things. We looked at the syllabi of many institutions, 200 universities, and so many schools across. I mean, on an average, we could say that usually it is if you think of course types, so if you think of course types in terms of design, technology, humanities, and uh, others, professional logistics, you'll find that design usually is around 30 to 40%. Technology, on the other hand, is 40 to 60%. Humanities is again 10%. Professional logistics is around 10%. So this is broadly the thing. So it's substantially kind of lesser. Humanities is not taught. Uh, you speak to architects and you find out what exactly do they do, and this is always a kind of a, the articulation is always very muddy. I mean, they want to make uh, buildings which are energy efficient. They want to make buildings which are cost effective. They want to make buildings which are efficient, and so it's more of efficiency driven, technologically efficient. And even when people speak of environment, it is spoken through a technological efficiency. There is no theory of space or understanding of theory of space or articulation on spatiality. Nobody, like, you cannot, there is nobody who kind of does that. And we also did a small kind of analysis of why are trained architects, unable to participate in the habitation making process of 90%. Because the way you are taught to make buildings over here, you get a piece of plot, and then you have a client, you have a brief, you have a design, you have an estimation, you have a detailed design, you have a tender, you have a process of executing it, etc., etc. The way it actually happens for 90% of people is, you get some finance, some furniture, some land is mobilized, something happens, somebody's getting married, so things are getting extended. While you're extending the building, you are adding a floor, you kind of, so it's a different logic, and in that logic, entry of an architect becomes very difficult. Okay, so broadly, this is the kind of inferences that we were looking at. He showed me the paper showing 2 minutes. I'm going to take 1 more minute more, huh? It's like 2 minutes plus 1 more minute, 3 minutes. Uh, so this is, I mean, the situation is quite grim, and it's kind of, it's like the what do architects do, and what is their contribution to the society, what is it, what is their future, what should be their pedagogy. It's kind of, it's very, very, very murky. I want to quickly jump into the next part on why research. Uh, you know, uh, I mean, there is one thing very, very clear, that uh, you know, in this country, around 80% of architectural education is managed through private organizations, so privately managed, out of which 25% is private university. A substantial bulk, which is 65%, is like us, state affiliated private colleges. And state affiliated private colleges are the worst kind of, in terms of any protection, any uh, support, anything, because state regulates everything for them across all states, admissions, fees, etc., 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 and doesn't give any support. So if you go to a private university in Bombay, for example, BSSA, the fees are 7.5, 6 to 7.5 lakhs. It's, so we are not even allowed to do that. And they have, so it's a kind of a, so private universities have some advantage, but and if you go to, for example, JJ, or academy, which is state funded, you'll see that admissions gets filled very quickly. The fees are much lesser, but the government pays 4 lakhs per student, spends actually 4 lakhs per student. So it's kind of a substantial. Uh, so it's institutions like ours which is kind of really, really threatened. Now, this is a threat. This is a very problematic situation. At one level, the demand is decreasing. On the second level, the institutions are threatened. What happens in the next 10 years? It's like a serious, serious problem. And what I personally believe and what we believe is that unless we are able to kind of, you know, push ourselves out of this education space and become academia, and the role of academia being to interrogate and produce new knowledge, actually really to interrogate life and produce new knowledge. And I think this is something which we have forgotten, and we have kind of landed ourselves into a coaching class model, basically, preparing people for exams. So this is the kind of model that we've got into. The role of academia to kind of interrogate life, society, and to produce new knowledge, I think has to be reclaimed, basically claimed, not even reclaimed, because it was never there in architectural education. And the primary role of academics, and we are all academics, is to do exactly the same, to kind of interrogate life and produce new understandings and new engagements, therefore, open new doors. And for this, research is a super important, thing to do, actually. And here I want to distinguish between market research, because there are a lot of people who are doing market research from academic research. Market research is interested in what goes in and what comes out. Academic research may be interested in things that may appear useless at this moment. A tree is growing. This is my favorite example. A tree is growing, mango tree. What fertilizer goes in, what water goes in, what comes out is the interest of the market. What academia is interested in: how much shade, what is the girth, what is the environmental effect, and everything else. So it may appear to be useless, but actually this is the scope and aim. And so, and this is something which architectural academia has not been doing, actually, or no academia, and that's why the whole problem. Uh, Institutionally, again, of course, we are in super precarious situation because there is no money to undertake research for us and to kind of train you all into research. It needs resources, it needs time, needs assistance in terms of research assistants. You need fieldwork assistants. You need money to go. Even one study trip of yours costs so much, no? Like, it's like, so if you were to kind of undertake fieldwork, so it requires money. So there is no money, and then there is no kind of there is no space. There is no research space, nor there is research time or research resources. Uh, we have at sea kind of produced some, we have kind of, try to realign some things where we kind of find at least time for our people. We try to integrate our research with the courses that we teach, as well as kind of work with that. There are plenty of things that we've been kind of initiating. I'll talk about it later. So just to conclude, I mean, one, education and architectural discipline is in crisis at the moment. I mean, it's just the crisis doesn't seem to be ending. It is just growing. New instances are emerging. Two, academia is threatened. There is no academia. It needs to be claimed and reclaimed. And three, you need, like, there is no hope from government, state agencies, because last 30 years the policy of education, higher education, as well as uh, interest and initiations, you don't see either state or central government kind of looking very closely. And they're doing a lot of popular things, opening aims and SPS everywhere, but actually not doing much. So there is that. And actual research content, for example, last point, for example, he mentioned that what kind of research is going on when they are done in private universities and in state universities. So there are typically three kinds: environment, Indian knowledge systems, and a technology which is now oriented towards artificial intelligence. So these are the broadly three times that is going on, in most of them. And you see that, and we have kind of, we've listed some 70 institutions where things are done, or else there are instrumental policy research that people do actually. So yeah, so this is the situation. I thought I'll kind of, lay it down for everybody else to kind of pick up from. Yeah, Anuradha.
Thank you, Prasad. I think that was really helpful, the way you set the context for what research means to architecture, and especially talking about education, academia, not education, and the kinds of research that are happening and why architects or architecture should be concerned about research. I think that was like really relevant because, and I think you're right, and absolutely your observations in your study are spot on. I think there are three areas in which research is happening, as you said: technology, AI, smart cities. I've seen in the past urbanism, and Indian knowledge systems, right? So, and the work that we've been seeing for this 2 days shows that CE is not doing that. It's trying to pursue other ways of proceeding, and other ways of articulating this journey through inquiry and research and architecture. So thank you for that. Um, I'm not sure my talk is 10 minutes, but we'll see how we go. Um, I think I don't have a lot of architecture, so I prefer to talk about architecture without talking about architecture. And I wanted to talk about as a way of thinking. I think research is not research. Research is an exercise in learning how to think. And I think through, I suppose, recollections. If you ask me how you think, I think through recollections, and recollections through spatial frames. It could be a window, it could be a bridge. So today I've decided to present a bridge. It's not a bridge in the civil engineering kind of bridge, or let's just research bridges. Certainly not. And engineering, even though it's a spatial metaphor, it's just something I've been attracted to. So for me, research has given me, I suppose, the attentiveness to track how I think and what's happening inside this thing, right? And I just wanted to touch upon a few, and that's the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And again, kind of going back to days when I look at that and think, as I should do that, because a bridge gives you're under a bridge or over a bridge, so there's a kind of a duality. The bridge offers you different perspectives. So I think that duality is something that I quite value. I remember exactly what I had that day for lunch. And so my recollections are incredibly vivid and visceral. And I think it's really important to do that before and after, above and beyond your training as architects and your education as architects. You must become incredibly aware of the recesses of your mind, I think. So I've taken a few prompts from the text that Prasad had shared, and I thought, let me think about what are my positions in response to some of the prompts that you have shared, Prasad. And I said, what does it mean to experiment in architectural research at the present moment? I say it's experiment in being present and in and with pasts and futures that matter. So I think the idea about being present is something that we take for granted. And I think, that there's a lot of times when we ask you to research and you go and find all kinds of things that you have to research. But I think being present is about that incredibly attuned sense of attention. And then, the prompt also asked, in the present moment, how do we locate and position ourselves as architects? And I think I'd rather be a weak architect, an architecture of weakness, and promote this idea of weakness. And I'll take you through some of the texts, and I didn't want to cover that right away, but this idea of weakness, I think, is strength. So not to go at research with this veracity, or to go at designing with this aggression and this, yes, articulation comes, but weakness is valued. So that's something that I just wanted to put out there. And then the present moment is here, not just a specific time and space that surrounds us, but also an incomplete duration that extends into the past and across geographies infinitely. And I thought, what about the epistemologies of daydreaming? And to what extent do we factor in daydreaming as a research method? So because I do a lot of it, and I probably have done a lot more of my share. And generally, a lot of these things are taken as negative things, but they're not, right? So for a person who doesn't and can't swim, I'm incredibly attracted to waterscapes, anything fluid, anything watery, probably because it has that sense of fear and forbiddenness. So it's again that, you know, and again, when I see these things, I know exactly when it was taken, what was the month. You know, so that sense of recollection and being present, when we're talking about being present and knowing exactly why I took that photo, what I was feeling, what was the temperature, what I was wearing. I have this incredible sense of being present in the moment and why that photo matters to me. You know, and it can do all sorts of things like remind you of why that particular photo was taken, why that trip was taken, what that had any special meanings for you. It's just a bit slow. I may have skipped one, I'm not sure. We'll see. Did I skip a slide? No, I didn't. I'm okay. So this is it's not somebody I really worship. George H. Mead, it's fine, 1932. Writes this lecture, talks about the passage of time. They said a study of passage involves the discovery of events. These simply cannot be parts of passage. These events have always been characters of uniqueness. Time can only arise through the ordering of passage by these unique events. All of the past is in the present as a conditioning nature of passage, and all the future arises out of the present as a unique event as transpires. So just a framing of the kind of kind of imbrication of all these things. A lot of people are doing future studies, and we study about history. So all of these things are kind of entangled and quite quickly becoming. It's not quite easy to disentangle a lot of these things. But so and Ignacio de Sola Morales, as his essay on architectural weakness, I thought was really interesting, and I love what that he says, or that he says the monumentality of weak architecture is not continuous with the monuments of classical age, but only what remains within the present condition of the term monitu, that is to say, of recollection. That is a strength or weakness when they adopt a posture that is not aggressive or dominating, but tangential and weak. So, so when we've been talking about through the review and discussion of your works about what is that, what is that thing that you would do as a consequence of your research? I think I'm always talking about, is that 10% contribution, 20, going at something, with tenderness and with gentleness and with some level of weakness and rather than aggression and domination. And then I saw this quotation from another PhD student who seems to be working on epistemologies of daydreaming. Daydreaming gives a model for some large-scale features of philosophy, and it presents a challenge to the recent project of developing what is called the logic of the imagination. Mind-wandering as a special case of spontaneous thought, which is more deliberately constrained than dreaming, but less deliberately constrained than creative thinking and goal-directed thought, which is you guys are kind of doing the latter, and well, dreaming is not something that you really have control on, but daydreaming is a much more kind of a structured, I wouldn't say more structured, but much more of a freeing sort of a thing. And I guess because if I daydream and I think, there are times when I'd be sitting in a meeting. I've done that throughout my undergraduate degree, and I encourage all of you, and you're probably all doing the same, and it's fantastic because that is really a core of creative thinking, and that's really, really important. So just looking at, I used to look at waterscapes. So why? Because those spaces, because I've lived transnationally, I've been a kind of itinerant traveler, migrant of some sort, who's lived between different countries, different cities, locations. I don't seem to have a route, I don't seem to have a home. in some sense, I'm, I'm not intellectually homeless, but I'm kind of physically in some sense, in the sense that I don't really I have an address on my Aadhaar card, but I don't live there. So that says a lot about the sense of home that I put it there and I lived there for 1 year. So I don't really have a home. But it helps me to kind of think about places that mattered, and again, why these particular images are important, and they're all from different places. Again, I don't really know why I'm showing them to you, except that I kind of tend to think back through the waterscapes and these kind of landscapes that I've encountered. Going kind of counterclockwise, I've got Suzhou, I've got Calicut, I've got a student model, I've got another lake in Kerala, I've got Singapore, I've got Kochi, I've got flying over, I think what is that area, that lakes in the UK, and I'm flying between Manchester and Amsterdam, and on the left is the harbour at Portsmouth, UK, and then the centre is the pool inside the University House in Canberra, Australia. So it's a way of I kind of think back, and I'm not just taking it through a journey of my photo album on Google Photos. I think that just generally means something. And this is the reason I say means something, because again, research brings you back to this idea of researching what matters and what matters to you. And how do you recognize what matters to you? Does that lie in a book? Does that lie in reading 10 books and 5 articles? It doesn't really. It already lies within you to discover what actually matters. So using Prasad's prompt, how do we work with and beyond research methodologies drawn from other disciplines and fields? I think we're already doing that. But I really today wanted to talk to this idea of devices of engagement. And I think I use bridges and waterscapes as ways to engage. What does investing spatial methodologies for architectural research involve? Like I said, to start with, I thought it was, and there's a quotation from Heidegger, which I'm not going to really stay on. That's for Anuj. The bridge over the stream. So it really talks about the idea of the bridge and what the bridge does. And I specifically love this part. It says that the bridge is ready for the sky's weather and its fickle nature. Even where the bridge covers the stream, it holds its flow up to the sky by taking it up for a moment under the vaulted gateway and then setting it free once more. So, and I think in the morning, I also talked about the bridging between things, moving from one thing to the other. How do you bridge, your semester 1 and semester 2? Because you're always in a kind of a journey. You'll always be either traversing edges of either on land or on air or in terrains. So the idea of bridge is something, and again, that these kind of recollections really helped me with, so that was Venice, this was Suzhou in China, and that's in Portsmouth. A lot of these things matter because that view, when we look at that view, to me, speaks to me about my complicity as a settler, as an immigrant settler in a land that's not mine, because from that harbor left the first fleet that went to Australia and landed in Botany Bay, and there's a plaque there. So that view is incredibly poignant for me as a settler immigrant in a country, in a land that's not mine. So it says that matters. So that particular photograph tells me a lot. This is a photograph that Kush might recognize from the route between Calicut and Tamarsheri. And again, these are extremely beautiful spaces. This is a bridge that was in Hobart and Tasmania. And again, it testifies to my interest in the crossover between art and architecture and design. And because that led to my experience of Museum of New and Old Art. And that's the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And not that it's iconic, but that there's something about that photo that tells me that, that there is a perspective that you get from under the bridge, and which is much more interesting than being on the bridge, I think. So it's about perspective, it's about point of view, and that's what research is, I think. So when I talk about bridge, I talk about movement, I talk about changing from one state to other. I talk about perspective, I talk about point of view. And that's what research is, really. So that's why a lot of these metaphors really help me. Um, and that's the one I took from the car in Tokyo, going to the airport in the morning again. So, which tells me a lot about the everyday life. And so I just wanted to talk about, I know I've got a couple of minutes left. So, research for me is about intervals, crossings, movements, being over, being under. Place is found again and again and again. So that's your place in your discipline, and place is not just a physical place, but it's your place in your discipline, in your topic, and the idea of separating to connect again. I just want to talk. I want to just conclude because I'd been taking notes when Prasad was introducing, was making his opening comment. I wanted to talk about, maybe just touch upon a few things we've talked about today, which is to defocus and creative leap. That when I want to talk about architecture, I don't talk about architecture. So the idea of defocusing to have a creative leap. Research what matters and how to find what matters. I think that's what your job is. Attending to matters that structure our attention. How do we know what we're paying attention to? How do we become aware of how we're paying attention to? So be deeper structures of thought, and I think how to be aware of thought. Otherwise, you'll end up with these three topics that Prasad was talking about. You'll lapse into these really conventional, topic areas. And I think the way that you guys have presented your work really shows that you're already starting to do that. Mapping your own presence to structures of space, like I showed with the bridge, it's all about crossings. You're crossing some terrain. So I also want to talk about research poetics over research mechanics. There's a lot of research that is very much invested in methodologies, but I think it is really about the poetics of that research and not just about the mechanics of research. Researching things that no one else will, attending to matters neglected, and making visible what is visible. I really think that is your job as an architectural designer practitioner. Why an architect is first a thinker. I think it's really important. Why I think Prasad already made a point about why research is important for architects. There's a business case. There's a book on, why research is important for architects and why you can get good projects and great clients because you do research. But I really think research is so much more than that. It's not really about how to cultivate a great practice. I want to leave with one thought, and that's convention and norms. And a lot of what we research, there is a boundary to push. And it is in your hands. It's your responsibility as future professionals. In a historically rich and diverse country like India, norms are not shifting, whether they're caste norms, gender norms, norms around disability, around access, about wealth and class. They are not shifting, not really, not as much as we would like them to. So when we research in light of where institutional oppression becomes norm, norm becomes culture, culture becomes internalized, how are you, that's when paying attention to how you think and what you think becomes really important, because you have already internalized these structures of oppression. And I think as a researcher, it is really important that through architectural research, if you can start to challenge some of these structures of oppression. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anuradha. So, Rupali?
So I'll probably take 12 minutes. I have to move to my presentation. Yeah, I need that as well. Anuradha, the speaker. Thank you. It's Google Slides. Oh, you'll have to, if you can start it, then I can just move ahead. It's showing there. Actually, it's going to be a bit difficult. Maybe if I can come there because I have to handle 1, 2, and 3. That's a bit much. I don't have 3 hands. No, I can, because it's just easier for me to move it myself. Sorry, I'm just gonna switch over. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to present now are some fragments of notes from our ongoing work on South Asian architecture and urbanism at the school. Some of the questions we're asking at the school are, how can we learn from emergent knowledge structures that have been incrementally working out life forms through artistic practices that expand imaginations of life beyond colonial epistemologies? And my presentation is in 5 parts, and these are fragments of notes uh, from various places. And then I'll also kind of go into some of the questions that students have been asking from this kind of research and sort of discussions that we've been having at the school. So the first part, and these are stories. So the first one is called Of Disintegrations, Termites. In an autochthonous village a few hours from Mumbai, termites gnaw away at the foundations of a 100-year-old house. There is no pest control, no attempts made to arrest this process. Instead, the house is allowed to disintegrate in infinite small parts. The technique of this process involves leaving the foot of a chiseled rectangular column in the original state of the tree log. The rough-hewn parts of the tree stump peek out of the ground, sitting deftly below the rectangular column, which has gone through a rigorous process of cutting, planing, chiseling, polishing. In another part of the house, um, as if recording the memory of the tree from where this house obtained its materials, a slender tree trunk stands in place where a column would have been. It has replaced an older column that has disintegrated. Forms of repair are integral to the process of inhabitation. The building slowly disintegrates beyond repair and has to be completely rebuilt eventually. This process is tied up with rhythms of labor and festivals in various societies. Building becomes a social process in non-harvest times in agricultural societies. In recent times, when economies have become more complex, where tribal populations participate in circular migration, these rhythms are often severed. But the severance is more pronounced in the state response to these forms of inhabitation, where the government refuses to fund houses that are built with things like wattle and daub, which are dubbed in official parlance as kacha or uncooked. The permanent nature of construction in brick and mortar lacks the logic of incrementality. The result is an awkward space that is often out of sync with the lives of its inhabitants. The cycle of building, repairing, disintegrating, only to renew and reconstruct from the debris has been the crux of space making in much of architectural production in South Asia. The 7th century Kastamandapa in Nepal is a rest house in the Hanuman Doka complex made with wood. It is essentially an evolution of the party, a veranda that is a public space where people spend their time outdoors. So this is a party. The entire structure is made of timber with joinery designed in such a way as to allow individual members to be changed when they decay. The repair and maintenance were taken up as a community activity by self-organized committees called gutis, who would ensure the upkeep of community infrastructure. There were no centralized consolidated architectural drawings to guide them. Methods of assembly, proportioning systems, and ornaments and narratives were imbibed in people's body memories. Gutis worked as human assemblages, eschewing the central figure of the modern hero architect. In 2015, the Kastamandapa was completely destroyed by the earthquake. Guti committees fought to take charge of the reconstruction. Although ultimately they were not given charge after a protracted battle, they managed to deflect the counterintuitive reconstruction plan of strengthening the Kastamandapa using steel and concrete. As an earthquake-prone region, the joinery of the structure and others in the region are designed such that they are not only able to absorb minor shocks, but have the possibility of being completely reconstructed in the event of an earthquake. Common knowledge in the region is to construct such that joints only loosely fit. that they are not rigid or allowed to sway. They are allowed to sway. Colonial methods of construction brought an idea of permanence and rigidity. Architecture needed to be robust, unable to disintegrate, to be flexible, or to be ephemeral. These were seen as weaknesses to be overcome by ideas of permanence and durability, firmitas, which formed one of the arms of the Vitruvian triad, along with utility, utilitas, and beauty, venustas. The second story is called of Immersion's Vegetal Goddess. Footsteps made of rice paste make a map that traces routes that the vegetal goddess needs to take in this tribal house in Palghar near Mumbai to bless every corner. The goddess is made from 17 different plants and herbs found in the surrounding forest. The vegetal goddess arrives on the fourth day of the advent of Ganesh. While the bringing of the Ganesh idol is a recent Brahminical tradition co opted by the tribals, worshipping the vegetal goddess is a much older tradition that now intersects with the tradition of bringing the Hindu goddess Gauri. In the mainstream Hindu religion, goddess Gauri is dressed in a sari and ornaments and made to sit on a chair on the house, taking anthropomorphic forms. However, in the tribal village, she's a green goddess made of creepers and flowers as fragments of the field and the forest. She's placed in the kitchen close to the cooking space over a rice heap and other accoutrements from the field of the forest. Women stay up all night singing songs to the goddess. They carry this vegetal goddess by themselves to the field. Every field has a small demarcation for the placement of the goddess. It is a little red flower in the field. The number of flowers and placements are equal to the number of kitchens of the extended family. The goddess is made to sit in the field while praying for a bountiful crop. The goddess becomes one with the field and assures a good harvest the following year. Visarjan is a powerful concept both in the western and eastern coast of India, where gods, along with the majestic paraphernalia, are immersed and let go. There are several practices of creation and destruction, of care and sacrifice, and of building and dismantling in South Asia that have historically and in contemporary times shaped human ecologies. Here, totemic animal gods, mother goddesses, harvests, and animals that are enduring to people are created, cared for, and let go as a form of life. In this intense interaction with the environment, the practice of life happens. So, the third story is called of scattering, burning houses. In the state of Assam, in the northeast of India, people get together for joyous celebrations in the season of Magh Bihu. Here, large structures made of wood or bamboo and thatch, known as meji, are built through an elaborate community effort. They're stacked with rice and other grains. These structures are guarded all night by villagers who live in temporary structures known as belaghars, where they feast at night and in the morning as a gesture of thanksgiving towards the spirits for the bounty that season light the meji in the midst of singing, dancing, and feasting. Inspired by the Meiji burning was an artistic project called Assembly of Desire, a gathering of artists in Guwahati organized by the Desire Machine Collective, Nigang, Madhukalia, and others around ideas of scattering, gathering, and blowing on the shifting island of Majuli. They claimed that the absence of reference of Assam or the northeast frontier in the narratives of Indian history was due to the region's autonomy, fluidity, and unstable geography influenced by various natural calamities and the changing course of the flow of the river Brahmaputra. They drew their concepts from the precarity of the region, both from state violence inflicted on it as well as its indigenous worldview. The Assembly of Desire, inspired from the Meiji and the Belaghar, created an architectural space for an intimate gathering. Calling it an infrastructure of friendship, they created an extended occupation of time through performative presences in Majuli. After their occupation, they burned the structure, sending it back to the fields as a way of evoking transmutative forces. In a recent essay reflecting on their observations after Documenta 15, Rux Media Collective argue for the role of contemporary art as placemaking. They argue that the social as a category is now amid us in a maligned, reified, and instrumentalized way. This is where they propose the role of art as placemaking, in which the social is a terrain of experiment and the creation of contingent arenas in which to engage and dispute. This placemaking needs, they argue, affordances where imagination, meaning making, and a corporeal intimacy between gatherers creates new encounters. This placemaking, we argue, also needs affordances from the specificities of cultures of landscapes, matter, material, geographies, actors, and agencies to create a new egalitarian alchemies. The artists in Marjoli were experimenting with these new forms of alchemical gatherings. And just the last story is called of shifting moving houses. Again, another case in South Asia. This is a story of a prefabricated house in Mulshiganj, Bangladesh, that was moved to this new location by a family from their land that was inundated. They took the help of carpenters who are in the practice of making such prefabricated houses that can move and can be bought in parts and assembled on all kinds of lands. The house is made from wood from Nigeria and tin infills. They are non-standard houses. Um, so if you see this, the door frame is actually not standard. It's just 1 inch thick, and so where the hinge has to be fitted, you find this decorative slug where the hinge fits in, and this also makes the house lighter. The carpenters sell the house in a place called the Ghorer Haat or the house market. The tradition of tin wood houses has been around for more than 100 years, but the practice of making prefabricated houses on stilts has mushroomed locally in the last 3 decades in different parts of Mulshiganj as a response to the shifting conditions of climate change. Here, production of space has responded to the climate crisis, wetnesses, seepages, shifting land water relations, and property demarcations through an entire economic and cultural ecology involving a range of actors and agencies as opposed to practices of resistance and hardening. So just that brings me to the last section, 2 minutes, on the future trajectories and then pedagogies. What do stories and practices of disintegration, immersion, scattering, shifting, and flowing have to tell us about future trajectories? Questions of permanence are inextricably tied to notions of property. It is robust property that can be monetized, mortgaged, inherited, sold, and taxed. Colonial practices ensured there were no ambiguities in the way land and building were understood. They had to endure to become taxable. People would fish on the same land that they farmed on. Colonial structures found these practices problematic. They needed these to be clarified and made into dry land. Gypsies living on boats in Bangladesh were deemed illegal, whereas a floating existence was a form of life. The practices of shifting homes that have evolved in Bangladesh, as the Mulchiganj example shows, perhaps suggest future trajectories where permanence may not be the datum, but suggest new forms of existences that challenge ideas of property, permanence, and privacy that have become the givens in our modern existences. The multitudinous examples of repair and retrofit in South Asia suggest a form of life wherein aesthetics of continuous repair and incrementality are built into practices of inhabitation. Anna Singh asks us to think with precarity. She asks us what our world making could be if we thought with precarity as the condition of our times. For this, she tells us we need to tell a rush of stories, of polyphonic assemblages from human and non human worlds. The stories that we've been pointing to, but also that students have been discussing, are point to forms of inhabitation built on such polyphonic temporalities. Similarly, Donna Haraway asks us to stay with the trouble. She tells us that in urgent times, many of us are tempted to address trouble in terms of making an imagined future safe, of stopping something from happening that looms in the future, of clearing away the present and the past in order to make futures for coming generations. Staying with the trouble, however, requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as moral critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, and meanings. This is Donna Haraway. The cases we present in this presentation, as well as what the students present, have been presenting today and yesterday, deal with the complexities of extant human and non-human relationships of material and of geographies. So, okay, last 1 minute. Just that brings me to the last point of pedagogy of life. How do we learn then? If for pedagogues, the important question then is, if we really need to shift the very frameworks of world making, what should our pedagogic structures be like? How do we learn from forms of life that are not obsessed with the forward march of progress, of obsession of property, permanence, and privacy? Santos asks us, in thinking through colonizing methodologies, how is it possible to produce credible and reliable knowledges by means of methods that have little to do with ones that modern science privileges? And some clues to rethinking pedagogy through decolonial frameworks, we argue, may have to come from art as a form of life, breaking disciplinary boundaries that we neatly assign ourselves in the world of professionalism and extractivism. So just going through some of there's the Anga Art Collective, for example, in Guwahati, talk about a process called public pedagogy, and they call it the No School, that works with situated knowledges, and then really kind of challenge our notions of how we think of permanence and property. And then this is Ashvika Rahman, who built a floating photography school that she brought to Chalan Bhil, and sort of challenged the grammars of photography itself. The worked with children, they were making these large cyanotype prints, but also kind of washing them in seawater, drying them in the sun, exhibiting in the fields around, and really sort of also made this handmade boat where some of the work was projected. So sort of really kind of working with, notions of wetness, notions of situated practices, and how one might kind of think of life and living from there. And just I'll end with this project from one of our students last semester, Dhruv, who kind of also himself lives in one of the site and services um, buildings in Mumbai, and sort of looked at practices of how development happened around him. It happened through incrementality, from small contractors working, very carefully documented how the mechanics of how this process really kind of worked out. And then in that sense kind of produced a kind of toolkit for small carpenters to kind of craft space, because what he realized was that what the carpenters what the small contractors were doing was, working with small incremental processes, but they were really not working with space making. So here he kind of introduced his process of space making into the structure. And then yeah, there was another project that sort of worked with dogs and their kind of sensorial landscapes, and suggested a completely different way of inhabiting space, which was not for dogs, but learning from animals, really kind of rethinking the coordinates of how human beings live and kind of think of life, think of space, which is, not necessarily propertied or bounded. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rupali. So we'll move to Kush.
not, then I'll just. So hi, hello everyone, and thank you to all the presenters that have gone before me. Thank you for these rich sort of frameworks to think with, and think about research. Tonight I'm going to weave a vignette, each on care work as method. I hope these slides work though. And if not, then I'll just keep sliding them. Okay. I'm going to weave a vignette each on care work as method, care work as pedagogy, and care work as praxis into tonight's talk to help locate myself and my research in the present. As someone working at the intersection of architecture and the digital humanities, I often begin with the premise that technology will not save us, which follows Paris Marx's rallying call for structuring the discourse on technology and politics along socially just lines. At the same time, however, by bringing digital tools and methods to study the human condition, or by bringing a humanity-centered questioning of technological and computational worlds, we might just make new kinds of research creation and critical toolkit building projects possible. And this is how I'd be describing the digital humanities and its promise in the next 10 minutes. The first vignette is an excerpt from a forthcoming series that Delia Duangwa Wendell and I have co-authored and co-edited for Platform, titled Pulling Closer, Caregiving as Method. In 2021, the Society of Architectural Historians hosted the workshop Caregiving as Method to explore the role of caregiving in architecture. It was organized by Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui with contributions from Jay Sifas, Lillian Chi, Alice Mendoza, Ikem Stanley Okoye, Itohan Osaimvesi, Peg Ross, Delia Duangba Wendell, and me. Each of her works were subsequently published in the Gethier papers and joined in 3 panels, one each on the topics of care, repair, and method, by moderators Can Bilzel, Garnet Cardogan, and Anna Miliaki. The themes and questions animating the workshop were made especially timely by the pandemic, but are in many ways ordinary engagements with questions of support and engagement in contexts of social inequality. The workshop brought forward thoughts on caregiving by scholars whose historical research has been enriched, even defined by their entanglement with the care of others. In retrospect, all 3 panels grappled most centrally with a question that Cadogan posed early on to us. What does it mean to think of care as a way of pulling something closer or pulling others closer to you? My own contributions to this discourse have been around issues of the post-custodial archive, or to follow Terry Cook, the idea of moving away from traditional institutional custodianship of archives to the very process of archiving with the creators of cultural records, such that one's expertise mediates both of these sides without being exclusive to either one of them. This line of inquiry is ongoing for me, especially as I engage simultaneously with records that are left out, objects or lives that are outside the frames of daily reference, and technologies which are non-proprietary and community-centered. In the pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed Collective, for example, we are currently working with the conceptual and methodological frameworks of minimal computing, Feminist Data Manifest No, the Endings Project, and post-custodial archiving to scaffold a relational collection of digital humanities resources and teaching artifacts that serve as a communal exchange for information, strategy, and advice bound to the community and its contested meanings. Counter to uncritically participating in the harvesting logic so commonly found in today's digital culture, which tends to occur in top-down, one-directional, and institutionally predetermined ways, our approach to building this repository is centered and considers digital harvesting that is driven by community control and by keeping data sovereignty within communities. The second vignette on care work as pedagogy segues from the first and draws from a recently published piece on digital humanities workshops, again coming out of the pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed Collective for an edited volume. In our time planning digital humanities workshops together, we have been repeatedly confronted with the comment that our workshops are too centered on reflection and dialogue and not focused enough on digital tool learning, hands-on skill building, and digital product creation. Indeed, this idea of the hands-on workshop, one that focuses not so much on discussion or process, but rather primarily on tools and skills learning towards product building, is a common objective of many digital humanities workshops. An objective that not only reinforces a traditional knowledge skill binary in the humanities, but also its corresponding and increasingly market-centered push for professionalization to address the so-called crises of the humanities. Our classrooms in teaching scholarship try to imagine and bring into view new possibilities of research, away from the binaries of academic and applied work, and towards their contextually grounded, structurally oriented, and community-focused integration. In a world wherein colonial, capitalist, queer-phobic, transphobic, ableist, casteist, and classist violences are perpetuated, reenacted, and transformed within and through digital infrastructures, taking the time to slow down, collectively discuss, and collaboratively rethink how we approach this work is urgent, necessary, and utterly important. Our argument as a collective is to move past the instrumental functions of tool acquisition and product creation common to design and digital humanities training towards reconsidering the role of pedagogy in fostering anti-colonial relationships and organizing work within, beyond, and alongside the academy. This line of inquiry calls for understanding process as product within DH work, as a set of anti-oppressive ethics towards living communities, ongoing acts of relationship building, and continuous care work. Acts, experiences, communities, and connections that may not be as concretely discernible outcomes of a studio or a classroom as, say, a website, a map, or an online archive, but which are verbs and embodied experiences that provide the foundations and nourishment for working within the digital humanities mindfully, responsibly, and accountably in ways that seek to stop rather than perpetuate colonial harms. In the design of our pedagogies, for example, we take inspiration from Sasha Costanza Chalk to produce work that leverages community knowledge, where success is not yoked to profit generation, and where technical prowess is not antithetical to humanistic ethics and values. By recognizing how design justice is fundamentally about power, we ask who wields this power in the design process, what do they do with it, and how do those decisions affect marginalized and oppressed peoples? We strive to provide classroom participants with a knowledge base to think through and think about creating position statements, projects, and initiatives that uphold ethical design principles, equitable processes and products to counter problematic systemic power structures. To think past and beyond universalist design affordances. That is, it is when the toolkits employed by designers are queered, when they are recalibrated to account for intersectional analyses, that the universalist subjectivity is problematized and the unique positionalities of the user base are accounted for. The third vignette is about care work as praxis, about inhabiting a space of research on queer futures, as everyday enactments of queer futures, about making common cause with queers and queens surviving the academy, others that may not have survived the academy, and still others that may never choose to be in the academy. Folks with interests in social justice pedagogies, gender and computational systems, queer and trans community histories, and feminist digital media. Folks who make critiques through games, needlework, writing, teaching, archival care, soft sculptures, and interactive stories. Folks mending the split, to quote Maria Cotera, between the places where we first developed the desire to know and the places that shaped that desire into authorized ways of knowing, end quote. Folks naming the violence of Savarna merit and those outside this default. Folks moonlighting and debt-laden, and all of us searching for protection from from sexist, queerphobic, and transphobic hostility without being incorporated into the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion status quo. What a joy and an honor it is to steward and participate in a lab where folks from different academic years and programs, including recent graduates and non-graduates, can anchor themselves around queer feminist histories and reimaginations of the world that won't see us the way we see ourselves. Over the last 2 years, my students and I have been working to create a bibliography on queer design with keyword essays and deeply embodied annotations of influential, ignored, and even obscured queer works connected to art and design. The objective of this work is to extend individual student interests into keyword essays, as well as ground queer art and design artifacts and materials in specific cultural contexts. Correspondingly, I've also been inquiring into the question of what digital infrastructures might constitute a queer archive. The objective of speculating with technology is to study and experiment with digital software models for the Queer Design Bibliographic Project, and in relation to its core questions and concerns of description, accessibility, privacy, and publicness. What then is our relationship to technology, including but not limited to digital technology? What does it mean to entwine experience and feeling with analyzing or reconfiguring a technological object in its community or use context? For example, a hypertext, a digital archive, or a video game. What might we consider as making through such an embodied, situated entwining? And how might that entwining help us challenge the conventional opposition between theorizing and doing, or research and creation in art and design? We are dodgy scholars, or this is how we introduced ourselves in one of my early published works with Blue Buchanan. We rupture normative expectations of productivity and scholarly impact by actively working on the frayed edges of a disrupting lab to further research through embodied and situated making that is reviewed in community. The tightrope walk of a subversive scholar is in the details. And with these details, we dodge being domesticated by the institution, following frameworks such as the Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, and Freedom Spaces by Loria Garcia Pina. To conclude, I've always urged myself and my students to dream with citations, to think beyond known categorizations of queer selves, and to participate in the project of queer and trans liberation non-linearly, in community-centered ways, and as scholarship. This persistence to inquire historically, deeply, and relationally, without collapsing or diluting the origin points of knowing, and against territoriality in scholarly praxis is stewardship, an epistemological frame that I draw upon and keep learning with Black, queer, trans, and women of color feminist writings on intersectional care work, or what it means to be entrusted with the care of something close to you. A frame which has enabled me to study how we make care for objects and relationships that are valuable rather than proprietary, and a frame that keeps reminding me to scaffold both nimbly and carefully the worlds that femmes, queers, and trans bodies are futuring in and alongside the academy. And tonight I'm going to leave you with these reflections to help expand the conversation and research and practice, including but not limited to architecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Kush, for that. So we'll move to Vishwanath.
Thanks. So we often talk about society in crisis, we talk about climate change, we talk about wars and other issues, and we look at how, as architects, we can respond to it or deal with it. But I think before that, we need to talk about architecture in crisis. And I think Prasad already mentioned in his talk about how architecture and architects are becoming elitist and increasingly irrelevant to society. Because we are only dealing with 10% of society, so on and so forth. So I will not detail that out. So that, however, I think that there is a second crisis that architecture faces, the crisis that it lags far behind society. Now, this crisis is not new. I think a lot of people have written about how architecture is one of the last art forms to negotiate or to deal with change in society. So it first happens in literature, or it happens in painting, sculpture, and finally architecture moves. So this is nothing new. So what is new right now? I think what is new is that historically architecture, I would say, always lagged behind by a few decades, maybe 30, 40 years, to respond to what is happening in society. And till the 20th century, that was not a huge problem because paradigm shifts in society happened maybe once a century. I would say that since the 1990s, we have gone through two sets of paradigm changes in society. One is the advent of computers and internet, and the way it has changed so society organizes itself. And now, very recently, the advent of artificial intelligence and this questioning of what is the relationship between human beings and computers or computational power. And because this has happened so quickly, I think now architecture is 2 steps behind. And my fear is that these paradigm shifts in society will increasingly happen at a faster pace. And we are at a risk of being completely out of tune with times. So because of these two perils, I think as architects and as an architectural fraternity, we need to look at how do we conduct research and how do we ask questions of what is the relationship between architecture and society. So in that context, I'm suggesting a call to action. A call to action not so much for conducting different types of research in academics, but a call to action to experiment with different forms of research in academics. I make that distinction because what is considered a failure in an experiment is very different from what is considered failure in research. In the sense that if in an experiment, the result is not favorable to you, but if the result is still valid, then it's a successful experiment, right? So I'm really interested not so much in the research we do as architects, but the experiments we do with research in architecture. And based on this crisis of architecture in relation to society, I would like to talk of two avenues where one could or should experiment with research in architecture. One is the relationship of architecture with society, how architects operate. And the second is experiments with research on how learning and teaching can be modified to enable students to operate in that world. This is not to be confused with experiments of teaching research to students, but rather experiments of, for academics, experiments on researching how to learn and teach so that we can enable students to deal with the correlation between architecture and society. So for the first one, and I would like to talk of it by giving examples of some of the experiments I've been doing in my teaching as well as research experience. And these experiments are of varied kinds. Some experiments are one-day experiments. Some experiments have been one-semester experiments. Some experiments have been 5-year experiments. And there is a 50-year experiment, obviously, which I have not finished. It started in 2008, so it's the 15th year of that experiment running. What I find fascinating, if you Google for the oldest running experiment in history, it's something started in 1927. So it's in its 96th year. I find that quite fascinating that you could do quick experiments and you could do slow experiments. So I'll share some of these experiments. On the other hand, some experiments have been individual. I'm the only one doing the experiment. Some experiments have been in groups with students or with colleagues. And some experiments, the largest experiment was with 212 students and teachers. So entire faculty of architecture SEPT was doing an experiment. Yeah? So I'd like to talk about all of these in the context of experiments on relation of architecture to society and experiments on learning and teaching. So to begin with the first one, experiments on making sense of the relationship between architecture and society. I think there have been 3 kinds, or I'm interested in 3 kinds of experiments there. Experiments on modes of practice, how do architects practice? And should we inherently change the way architects practice? I think something that you briefly talked about in your presentation as well. The second experiment is about uh, tools of designing for that changed mode of practice. What are the tools, methods, processes that we use for designing? And the third is about what is good or appropriate architecture. And so questioning what is the new relationship that we want to create between architecture and society. So for the modes of practice, the experiment which is now, where I just finished the third iteration, um, is in the practice studio that I conduct. Okay, so a disclaimer or sort of a word of caution here. So you talked about the difference between the educational space and the academic space and the difficulty of institutions to do research uh, because of lack of funding. So for a long time, I have been using the educational space to conduct research on academics. There is a big caveat here that you have to be very careful that one, experiments can fail, but the teaching outcomes have to be met. So the failure of the experiment cannot be passed on to the student if I'm using education as a form of experimentation. So I'm very careful about that, and I'm not talking of how I manage that in this presentation. So, uh, so it has been fascinating looking at, right now I've looked at 45 odd practices across India, 20 odd in Ahmedabad and 25 odd uh, pan India, to try and see what are the different ways in which architectural practice is being conducted and whether there are any alternative modes of practice. But that is more of a research component of the studio. The experimental component of the studio is where students have to design their own practice within an academic space, literally design an office, design methods of practicing, and then do 2 or 3 projects as part of that practice. So I would just share one anecdote where one student was trying to design a practice where she wanted to deal with, she wanted to provide architectural services to extremely disadvantaged and poor people. And there was a big challenge of how do you organize the monetary aspect of that practice. The second one, which is of tools of designing, uh, uh, so this was an experiment that happened only for one semester, where we conducted one entire studio where no plans were made, no sections were made, and yet you had to design a project and you had to communicate that project to the jurors, uh, completely using virtual reality and 3 dimensionality, just to understand whether we as architects are comfortable enough to discuss and about space without talking about plans and sections. Uh, the third one, maybe I'll keep that for later, because I want to move into experiments on learning and teaching of architecture, which again are at 2 levels. One is at the level of curriculum itself, so it's at an institutional level, and the other is at a course or a teacher level. So at the institutional level, there have been 3 experiments, or rather 3 things that have been running. One is the changes in curriculum at SEPT. So 2008, we had a curriculum. Then 2008, we started working on a curriculum for 2012. Then we had a 2014 and 2018 curriculum. And I'm also helping a design institute called the Design Village in running or designing their curriculum. And now NITTE, which is the institute in Mangalore, where my question has been simple. What is the value of a curriculum in an institution which wants to talk of creativity? Because curriculum is a predetermination of what you will teach and how you will teach. And when we talk of creativity, we talk of looseness, we talk of having freedom, we talk of having to do what we want to do. So how do we take something like courses, credit, marks, etc., and can we apply it the same way we apply it to an engineering or maybe medical institute? The another experiment which has been at the course level, and I'll just share two of them there. one experiment that I've been doing, or one thing I'm trying to figure out for myself, is what impact does the shape of the site have on the shape of the site have on potential of producing varying designs among students. If I change the shape of the site and the size of the site by 5 meters more, does it allow students to produce infinite more variations in the design? Now, this is a very granular kind of experiment that is happening at the, so in the last 5 years in a housing studio that I'm taking, I've given 30 sites and there are about 12 students. So I now have 360 projects and I'm analyzing what every change in the shape or the size of the site had on the degree of variation provided, produced by the students. And the second experiment is what impact does number of functions and the relative area have on the degree of complexity of the student project. So I'm very interested to find out that if it's a second year project or a third year project, should I give 12 functions or 20 functions? If I give 12 functions, should the function with the largest area be thrice the size of the smallest function? What happens? If it is 5 times the size of the smallest function, what happens? And if I give a program where the biggest function is only 1.5 times the size of the smallest function, what difference does it produce in the design of the students and the complexity of the design of the students? And the findings there for myself have also been quite fascinating. So my idea was just to share like a broad variety of experiments that I'm doing in order to understand or in order to see how we can conflate this academic and educational space. Of course, there are other forms of research as well, which are more sort of standardized forms of research, writing papers, getting grants, doing research. So all the research that I do on urban housing is more like research and not experiments on research. So I think as institutions, we need to find fascinating or new ways of experimenting on different forms of research and thereby look at how we can broaden the scope of research in architectural institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kash. Rohit.
It's 7:30 and Prasad was sleeping. And so, should we skip my presentation and then just go for the discussion? Kind of, okay. So let me just start off while Dipti is kind of pulling up my presentation. If by architecture of thickets, as Prasad Kanolkar spoke yesterday, one means space has a thickness, a density, and opacity, then how might one engage to understand it? And on this panel, we also have the second question, how might one experiment with the space of practice in this thicket? And Prasad Shetty in his talk opened up a very grim scenario for us, I mean, very depressing scenario for us, and asked us to open up a space, open new doors, I mean, which is the question for all of us over here. And when you kind of hear that, one is reminded of Jim Morrison's song, Come On Baby, Light My Fire. I was like, that's been the song that has been running in my head since then. I want to draw attention in this presentation to Forests of Imagination, which is an ongoing inquiry that I was about to commence in 2022, and also the title of a panel that I was formulating for the SEA's annual conference of that year. It turned out to be the title of the conference than the panel itself. Now, it's something that I've been engaging with, and it's the first time I'm kind of showing it to my colleagues at SEA as well as anybody over here. Its backstory is situated in a work that, a short research that I was doing prior to that for 8 months, where I delved into articulating a method to read into the ways in which households in Mumbai, living in diverse kinds of housing typologies, experience everyday wetness and its extreme events, and respond and innovate in its face to endure it. And how do they come to Sutur built form? I won't get into the details of this work. So basically, it's kind of strategies of households with their everyday experiences to respond in very ordinary ways to adapt to the monsoon. That was the work. And what one is doing in that work is looking very closely at the spatial kind of operations that emerged. I titled this work as Architectures of Exfoliation. And in titling it as Architectures of Exfoliation, it emerged as a critique of the spatial vocabularies that articulate mirror images of the very things that they oppose. And in today's world, in the contemporary moment, we're kind of seeing many kinds of explorations that articulate provocations, architectural provocations, spatial provocations in mirror images. The challenge, the spatial challenge for me lay in how and why move beyond mirror images. And what I found through my field engagements is that mirror images tend to weaken the claims of those that they claim to really align with. And that's really a kind of question for thinking about architectural vocabularies, the politics of the contemporary moment. So at that, in 2021, so this follows a train of thought over the last few years. This work drew attention to a meantime of weather change as against its tipping point on the one hand, and to the ways in which beings and things pay attention to one another in their habitat. And while I was articulating this in the previous set of annual conferences at sea, architectural scholarship, and particularly that coming from the one that was emerging from landscape architects, were articulating imaginations of forests and sponges as infrastructures to hold monsoon's wetness in an era of climate change. So it is kind of situated in that kind of, this kind of frame or kind of space of investigation of climate change, which has really become a moniker for where the research money lies nowadays, that it is important, but often doesn't end up doing much in the everyday lives of people. That the work that is emerging from kind of addressing climate change issues. And it's also nested, Forests of Imagination is also nested in a larger collaboration whose stakes lie in the challenge to articulate an epistemology of multiplicity as cities seek to put into place climate change action plans and infrastructures in this meantime. And this epistemology of multiplicity connects with also what Prasad Shetty spoke about, the judiciary, the Indian judiciary, articulating that architects are just one of the many actors who would be engaging with the built environment, and not necessarily the most important people. So then what does it mean to engage with the epistemology of multiplicity that we find ourselves in today? So prior to answering the how, I found myself asking two questions, which are written over here. I want to read them out. So the thinking with democratizing climate change over here is an attempt to think from, as opposed to think about Mumbai's environment. I'll very briefly tease out, because for the lack of time, very briefly tease out the kind of narratives that are emerging from explorations into Adivasi experiences and senses of transformation in the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. Oh, we don't have sound, right, here? It's okay. I mean, I'll kind of go ahead. I mean, this it's a poem sung by an Adivasi poet about invoking. No, just go ahead. It's a poem that is sung by an Adivasi poet invoking the Vagdev to come and save the forest. To come and save the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And what I found was that Adivasi residents of the Sanjay Gandhi National Park have been drawn into an alliance, or kind of have joined hands with Mumbai's middle class environmental activism. This is a paradoxical alliance. And I don't mean to go to the morning kind of discussion, but what I mean to point out over here is kind of Amita Bhaviskar's work of thinking about bourgeois environmentalism, which is paradoxical to the ways in which Adivasis experience, engage with the space of the Sanjay Gandhi National Park and the stakes that are embedded in those. So why and how do Adivasi communities move between the physical and conceptual boundaries of the forest and the city? And in turn, embedded within that is the question of why do they move between indigenous and colonial epistemologies and ontologies? It is not one or the other, but a constant movement between both of these that emerges as a stake in the question that they put forth for you in conversations with them. So let me tease out two vignettes, and ethnographic vignettes. This work will kind of emerge in summer or monsoon, next summer or monsoon, as it is scheduled for an online exhibition. Let me tease out two vignettes that open out for heuristic tropes or conceptual tropes. And I'll try to do that very quickly. The first vignette is titled Exile in a Garden. A renowned scholar's provocation, the forest is an infrastructure to hold wetness, had gripped our minds. During the initial field walks, we wondered, if indeed it is true, how should we draw its surfaces that seem to fold onto one another to hold the monsoonal waters? We were literally and metaphorically lost in the forest until we met the grandmother who insistently corrected us. And us is this me along with my colleagues. I've kind of not mentioned them here, Vastavikta Bhagat and Ruchita Sarvaya, who are not here today. So the grandmother who insistently corrected us, but insistently corrected me. What you call a forest is our garden. And although I was kind of exposed to Philip Descola's work on thinking beyond nature and culture, I was making the mistake again and again of using the term forest to refer to the space that they were living in. Subsequently, the dense foliage now opened differently to our eyes. A narrow mud-lined path lined by lemon, starfruit, banana, papaya, guava, custard apple, mulberry, and several other trees. And there is a list of many of them, which I'm not mentioning over here, led us to a shaded backyard of few houses. Here, aubergine, chili, curry leaf, cucumber, ladyfinger occupied small spaces protected by sari or plastic sheet fences alongside jasmine, hibiscus, marigold, rose, and adusa. Nonchalantly, we asked a few women, who takes care of this garden? Gazing back suspiciously, they replied, we women do. We've planted these. The ones that grow further away from the Pada, which is the Adivasi hamlet, grow on their own, but we, the Adivasi clans, take care of them. So the garden emerges as a space of inhabitation in the cyclical time of the tropical monsoon and the negotiation, the spatial and temporal negotiations that happen between various kinds of beings. I'll go a little further. The space from where one enters the Pada today, the grandmother reminisced, were all farms. We used to farm rice. I'll finish, just 2 more minutes after that. We used to farm rice, sorghum, finger millet, white muesli, and maize. One day, the forest people over here, now who is the forest people gets upturned, conventionally seen as Adivasis, but in Adivasi vocabularies, the forest people are the forest officers because they came when the forest department was set. There was no imagination that the word jungle in Marathi does not translate into the forest to the forest department over here. Came to stop the Pada residents from farming and later planted some type of trees in their farms. With my parents' generation, everything was wiped out. Now we feel like we are in exile. Our condition is like this, precarious. From the moment we lost our farms, she said, pointing to her frail, thin body against the rusted GI sheet, I think I missed a slide there, rusted GI sheet walls of surrounding houses. In producing a forest, the forest people were producing precarity for Adivasi residents. So how does climate change emerge in the narratives of Adivasi residents? We are kind of very familiar with climate change producing exile and migration. But Adivasi residents in SGNP articulate themselves in exile, in situ exile in the forest. And climate change is not something that is happening now or will happen in the near future. It happened in a recent past. In 1981, when the forest was declared and farming activities were stopped, as relationships with other kinds of beings, trees, animals, leaves, and plants changed. They changed the climate of the forest. Just give me 2 minutes. Okay. So, exile in a garden. The second vignette, and I won't kind of get into the detail of it, but it's titled as Exfoliation in a Traverse. So, the trope of exile really essentially opens out linear time and how linear time in imaginations of the forest has flattened ideas of cyclical time that kind of are embedded in the space of Adivasi imagination. Exfoliation in a traverse are ways of engaging with how Adivasi residents move or kind of engage with colonial ethnographies and historical archival records, because they have disciplined them in many ways, articulating them as primitive, unproductive, militant, and uncouth. So how do they kind of engage with them, and kind of there are narratives of how imaginations of home have transformed in the last 20 years. I won't get into the detail of that. But in kind of these, between the garden exile and the traverse, we find architectures of exfoliation, which is knowledges that they draw upon from their indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, but also garner newer kinds of capacities that don't rely on indigenous epistemologies, but draw upon the colonial epistemologies and ontologies to move in between both of them. So democratizing and decolonizing climate change, which is a thrust that seems to be emerging in climate studies literature, seems to be fraught in many kinds of ways as one has to move between most of these things. In terms of thinking about the narrative over here, these are a series of postcards, 80 postcards, with kind of 4 sides, having drawings as well as text as well as images, each with a 200 to 250 word vignette that will become a digital exhibition as well as a physical set of postcards. And in articulating postcards, I'll kind of say that these are postcards. I will stop at that. I'll just open it up for discussion. But in the discussion, I'll take up the question of why postcards and why engage with the colonial artifact in the present moment.
we've clearly underestimated how much everyone had to say on architecture research methods. Okay, so I mean, I don't necessarily want to summarize, but so maybe just draw out some thoughts. One that seems to be clearly emerging across all the speakers, this question of, I mean, the kind of questions that each of you seem to be struggling with, or even the kind of tools that you seem to be working with, come from a certain uh, uh, position that each of you have, right? I mean, particularly, this being an academic within a set curriculum, trying to sort of find space to open up other ways of thinking about architecture, other ways of thinking about research, but also sort of wanting to create a space that is, in some sense, a space that is slow, a space that isn't necessarily, that allows space for failures, for small experiments that can be repeated at different durations, right? Sort of a space that doesn't necessarily think about research as, as Kush put it, not necessarily as something to be achieved as, as a goal, but as a verb, right? As something you hold on to, sort of unpack, slow down with, to think with it, whatever material you're collecting, with some kind of a care, so that other things can open up in that space. Right? Uh, secondly was something, and this also comes from the discussion that we were having this morning, which is this question of, description and theory, and a lot of what a lot of the talks that seem to be working with is rather theoretical devices to see the world differently, right? It's not necessarily theorizing the world, right? But it's coming up with theoretical devices to see the world, right? Be it the idea of liquidity, of liquid forms, of bridgings and crossings, of disintegrations, of uh, you know of visarjan, of things that come and go, of again of care, of uh, of exfoliation, of working with other kinds of epistemologies. It's not necessarily to become that, but to sort of draw out certain theoretical devices, right? And this is something that we've been seeing in all the works, that like, all the works that you've been presenting might not necessarily have theorized the material, but what they do is sort of open up theoretical devices to see architectural forms, to see cities, to see spatialities differently, right? And that is something that you want to push yourself to do too, right? So, ideas of liquidity, crossings, sort of defocusing, these are all theoretical research tools to work with, right? Okay, there's a lot. I'm still going to stop here, but I mean, just maybe a quick minute, because this is sort of what I felt is that all of you sort of done a round of talking about your work, but I was wondering, if there's something like these cross connections that you find with each other's work. So rather than me sort of doing something that, okay, so what you sort of find in each other's work that seems to be important, but 1 minute this time, please.
Yeah, 1 minute plus 1 extra minute. No, I just want to, wait, sorry, I just want to, no, no, I just want to connect to your presentation. I'm just finding it difficult to see. Dipti, can you just put it on? So, I mean, I was struck with the connections with kind of queer theory, and I've arrived at the non-dualistic, the non-mirror images kind of work, not from queer theory, but kind of engagements with indigeneity over here, but not only indigeneity, but kind of uh, built habitats that have not emerged in master plan settings over here in Mumbai. So um, that was one kind of thing that I wanted to kind of draw attention to. And the second was, I mean, kind of, Anuradha kind of spoke about the use of theoretical devices, which is kind of, the search over here is for those theoretical devices that kind of emerge from the field. So you pose the field interlocutors as not somebody whom you are drawing data from or getting information from, but they emerge as figures for many kinds of things. In some of our engagements, they're philosophers. In some of our engagements, they become entrepreneurs, so on and so forth. So they become thinkers of space equally along with us. That's the second point. And kind of I kind of drew attention to the question of Prasad asking us to open new doors over here. The question of the postcards is situated in the work, in architectural work, in the work of urbanists, sorry, in architectural work, landscape architects work, but also in the work of urbanists, while artistic kind of provocations or interventions are kind of carefully are kind of paid attention to, very little attention is paid to the mundane work to kind of get them actualized onto the ground. And here, the work of Konjian Yu, who's the Chinese architect, who's kind of articulated this concept of the spun city. The idea of the spun city is kind of discussed, and images and architectural works are shown, but actually what emerges as a very important work is the letters written to the mayors, or even in kind of Matthew Hull's work or Solomon Benjamin's work in the South Asian context, are the mundane letters, parchees, and all kinds of engagements with state. So you may suspect the state, but you cannot escape or kind of avoid it. One needs to find out creative ways of engaging with it. The postcards are kind of located in that context. So yeah, I'll just stop.
Referring to Kashi's, you talked about the like experiments in pedagogies, and I think it brings us back to that idea of paying attention to where those opportunities present, because not every teaching project is going to offer that possibility. So I just want you to maybe talk about, because this is how do you teach as a research project? How your teaching itself is an inquiry, which is what kind of circles back to, you also said that a lot of what you're researching kind of feeds back, but it's not a kind of a force fit. It's not a force fit, but then again, this ideal idea to how do you pay attention so you know exactly where that opportunity is, being so present. And we talked about being in the present, how to experiment being the present, but also means being attentive, being present. And I've seen certain patterns. I haven't seen any patterns. And you're absolutely right that that you can experiment, but then the learning outcomes have to be met. And some projects will lend themselves to that inquiry, and some won't. And that's a practice I have as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where that opportunity finding mindset that you have, because it can't always be a force fit. Everything is not going to always work, right?
If I can also push all of you just to maybe spend half a minute to talk really about the tools of research. I mean, particularly because we're working with a field where drawing seems to be, and we've been, talking a lot about the limitations of how much drawing can allow us to make sense of the nonsense or the unrepresentational. If you can, each of you can also maybe spend half a minute to sort of open that up. I mean, whatever the struggles are and whatever, right, along with your comments or connections with each other's work.
Sure. I think, yeah, I completely agree. And the way I look at it is that I think most of the times as teachers, we think that the course or one course is the smallest unit of thinking about doing research. But like you rightly pointed out, there are some courses. There's one housing, there's that architectural theory course, for example, where the experiment is only 1 hour of one day. Or there's this urban housing studio project where there are these one-day time problems, and that course is lending me only 1 day of experimenting as a part of a small course. On the other end, maybe in some other cases the entire course is also an experiment. So yes, I think there are lots of uh, different scales, if I might say, at which experiments are occurring. I do feel that in institutionalized forms of architectural education, the course is seen as the smallest indivisible unit, which is reflected on the mark sheet. So I prefer to go one level lower than that, because there are a lot of courses where I cannot experiment with the entire course. So that helps.
Somehow there's a convergence of people, ideas, community, and then that's a right kind of an environment to undertake that experiment. If you did that it's almost like a setting, and if you did that in other contexts, it won't work. So that's what I'm asking you. Yeah.
I would say that I'm lucky that I'm in a setting where it is possible to do this kind of experimentation, which may or may not be possible depending on the nature of the institution or the collegium that you are with, or the kind of students that are there in the course. So that matters a lot. But to go back to, yeah, I'm personally also very interested in the role of drawing and its relation to architecture. Like I briefly mentioned, in that one studio, it was an entire studio where we didn't make plans and sections. In the final jury also, there was no plan and section. I had 3 sessions, jury sessions, because it was 15 students or something. So two jurors in each panel. None of the jurors were able to discuss the projects. Very fascinating. None of the jurors, students had made plan and sections as a backup, but they were not pinned up. Jurors found it very difficult, and there's a huge argument on how can you discuss architecture if you just show us a walkthrough. So I think in these forms, I think we are not experimenting enough with asking questions of drawing. And I think in one of these sessions, this discussion came up. I think the act of drawing gets polarized into either a technical drawing, which has a method to it, or a speculative drawing where anything is possible. And when it comes to technical drawing, you have to follow the conventions of a plan section or isometric or a axonometric. And then you have speculative drawings where suddenly we are not able to discuss, okay, how do I read that drawing? If there has to be a consistency in how everyone reads that drawing. I just wish that we could, or I think we should do more experiments with drawing as a tool or a medium of talking about space.
Kush. I mean, I was also just wanting to push it to. No, actually, to sort of give it a twist to the idea of drawing itself, because you do talk about pulling things closer, which is sort of drawing things closer. What drawing means in that kind of scenario.
So, but going back to the original question that you posed to all of us about any connections or resonances that we could see between works. One of the things that I really noticed very closely is, in all of these works, whether it is Rupali's or Rohit's or mine, there's an intentional orientation to producing anti-colonial critiques. So the kind of anti-coloniality which comes either in the context of indigeneity and Adivasi communities, or questions of coloniality that come with the very material making of shelter and inhabitation and practices that go with it, or the kind of coloniality that comes with logics of technological production. That was something that I was just saying how coloniality too gets to be defined and redefined in each of these spaces. But the other thing that I was quite interested in exploring further, or asking myself, but also to both Rohit, Rupali, and all of us at the table, I said, what are the kinds of contradictions that come up with subjectivation in research? And I think these are deeply subjectivized research projects. So whether it is techno-subjectivation that I grapple with, spatial subjectivation that Rohit, you brought out in your series of engagements with not just vocabulary, but lived inhabitation of what is conventionally understood as forest, or artistic subjectivation that comes with propositioning and intervention. So that's a question that I have. What are the contradictions that come with techno, spatial, artistic subjectivation in research building that is oriented to producing anti-colonial critiques? So that is a question that I've written down here. And to sort of think with this question of drawing, I think I'm interested in drawing out a set of relationships. So what does it mean to draw out a set of relationships, either between self and technology, draw out a set of relationships within standards, tools, and templates that are often part of design discourse? What does it mean to draw out these relationships as a way to locate power and then to challenge power? So, and then the form of that drawing out can either be a pedagogical toolkit, could be a video game, could be an interactive narrative, could be the drawing itself. But I'm interested in this in this practice of drawing out a set of relationships, but also as a way to rethink the standards, tools, and templates with which we think, whether it is space, architecture, design, or what have you.
I mean, there's several things that intersected, and I think what is interesting is looking at the idea of care infrastructure and pedagogy as care, and when you do that, then you're not thinking of a project alone, but you're thinking of life, and where you situate yourself and others within that. So I think that's an interesting positionality when it comes to education, because otherwise education becomes something that is out there, right? It's outside oneself. It's something that one is working with as an experiment, but which is devoid of life, right? And so then I think then where Kashi's kind of ideas of small incrementalities, of starting to look at things which may not be a large arc, but small sort of things that nudge you towards certain questions that lead to another question and another question, right? So I think that sort of tying that up together will be interesting, And then I think Anuradha's provocation of the poetics, like what does it mean to think of the poetics of where one, of a question of forms of life, where does it kind of allow you to, in some ways, not move in a linear direction, but sort of, refract in ways that allow you new ways of thinking of life and living. And then I think Rohit's kind of idea of also working with the non-binary is really about life, because it's impossible to work with the idea of binaries. And then of course Prasad sort of locating all of this in where we situate ourselves, where, how do we work with forms of research, where do we, because otherwise again education becomes, like Prasad said, a coaching class model, but where is the opportunity for research? And I think this is where, once you start thinking of forms of life as your location point, then each one of us is that researcher who is asking a long durée question. And when you start talking about a long durée question, then it's not a project, or it's not whether you have an opportunity or not. Everyone has an opportunity, because it is a long durée question that you're working with. And so an architectural project then becomes a moment in that practice, right? But you hold on to a long durée question, and work it out, not only with yourself but with your peers, and through care infrastructures and other things. So I think that's where the opportunity of research really kind of expands in exponential ways. Then it doesn't become a project alone. So
I was thinking in like to kind of again kind of you know remind you of the crisis, but remind you of the crisis to kind of remind you of the crisis, not to kind of push you off the cliff, but to to I mean, she brought in the whole idea of Visarjan. No, Visarjan, even in the case of Palghar, it's not Visarjan, like it's an invitation to start, to change and start new. It's not really to kind of close it, because Visarjan has this call for the next one. गणपती बाप्पा मोरया पुढच्या वर्षी लवकर या. So that whole thing, na, that Visarjan is a kind of a call for a shift, for a change, and I think in those, how do we kind of then, and that has been the experiment at sea since quite some time, how do we kind of rethink the model of institution of pedagogy of being. How do we rethink it then, and then in that, the whole idea is to kind of move from solving to enjoying, you know move from understanding to sensing, move from building to the idea of space, or and the and the and the and the and the you know the the form question, form question in research, but form question in the way we see also, because the form often helps you to, not often, form helps you to see things, to kind of sense things, to kind of uh, engage with things, etc. And then that form, the thing is that form, if it has to kind of, there is a durability question to form. You are pushed to kind of make the form durable, so that it becomes available, monetizable, usable, enlarged, etc., etc., etc. But form doesn't have to be that also. Form can be ephemeral. Form can be, you know, very temporally kind of, situated. It can, there are many ways to think of form. Form of form of seeing. It doesn't have to be a drawing, but it can be a narration. It can be a conversation like this at that moment, and then it is over, and then we move on to the other one. That form. Those are the form, because see, otherwise there is, like, he brought in the idea of colonial ways of kind of setting up. Like, if you look at the syllabi, very carefully, of architecture colleges, they teach you 10 things, and those 10 things you can learn in 1 year. Actually, like, it's not, and then it is not a substantially important. That's why you get, that's why the whole demand decrease, no? Because it's kind of, you look at it, it's not substantially different from how it was 50 years ago. It's kind of, more or less similar. Somewhere twisted as per technological requirements, etc. So so it's so what is it that the architectural pedagogy? It's like why go beyond understanding and go towards sensing? It is, and it's not separated. Understanding and sensing. It doesn't come like sense. Like often you understand what you don't sense. It's quite a thing. And sense, to push sense, if you say, and sense pushes you to act. Your sense, your your whole visceral sensing pushes you to act. You know, it's very powerful kind of it's a powerful kind of experience. So how do we kind of build that as a pedagogical intention? So I think we've been kind of trying to work with that with your your years, but also the years before. And so pedagogically we kind of experimenting with that. Institutionally also there is this urge to snatch time, snatch resources, snatch whatever is available otherwise. That whole thing of, because if like I'm in the list of heads of the Department of Architecture colleges in Bombay, and there are some 30 of them, and then kind of everywhere. It's always kind of the worst group to be in. Always kind of trying ऐसे ये नहीं हुआ यूनिवर्सिटी में, ये नहीं हुआ, ये नहीं हो रहा है, एग्जाम डिले हो गए, ये हो गए, वो हो गया. आपके एग्जाम कोई डिले नहीं हुआ ना? नहीं होता ना? So it's that actually. How do you kind of do this? How do you kind of do that? It's like the because see, this time we are in such a political economy which you will not give you an institutional space and resource. The only act possible then is to snatch. Then how do you do that? How do you kind of work that out collectively, institutionally, think through that? How do we kind of work that out is something which is your problem and our problem and our collective problem. And we have to work that out actually somehow. It's not possible. Like in the next 20 years, I don't see suddenly the political economy changing. In fact, even the American academia is kind of struggling with its resources that it was there, because that's the kind of a what happened. I think everybody's showing me time actually. Okay, so no, so 2 or 3 things. Pedagogically, how do you kind of that sensitizing and pushing you to act, and institutionally the snatch, that snatch and act. So I think that's the kind of a thing that we want to work with.
Anuradha was going back to, since you really were centering recollection, and I was thinking to myself, what does it mean to think of recollecting as evidencing? And I wanted to connect that to the question of longue durée research, that here the idea of evidencing is not in a conventional sense of evidence to support research, but evidencing one's relationship to research and with the world. And I think as students are thinking of their own sort of projects and understandings and relationship to research, it's interesting to sort of say, what is that relationship that you have with research that is ongoing, that either uses the metaphor of a bridge or a disruption or an ever-changing vocabulary that pushes against the binaries. But I thought that was interesting to sort of think of recollecting as evidencing, not in the sense of a source of knowledge, but the relationship between researcher and researched. And I was just thinking with that. But Prasad, since you started the presentation, and I think in one of your pointers, you mentioned that the percentage of curricular emphasis in technology is much higher than humanities. But that is where I was trying to come in and say, but what does it mean to pose humanistic questions of technology that can begin to then connect with Kashi's idea of possibilities with curricular redesign. And I think we begin to sort of then say, okay, even if technology has to have a high percentage, but what are the underpinnings of that? Could those underpinnings begin to shift and shift also the kind of curriculum that we are designing?
By the connection of technology to upper caste, to the elite, to the capitalist is so strong. The moment you try to kind of shift those, it's a super inconvenient question, and this is something we have to be done. We have kind of
No, I mean, I was just thinking, just back to what Prasad was saying, but what each of you seem to be doing, like this is to do with, where we sort of started about the symposium and just that there's an undergraduate seminar going on, that doesn't seem to be a template, that everyone seems to be in some way, uh, you know, uh, sort of creating their own space of research, despite all the institutional curricular issues. Uh, that doesn't, I mean, we think of the research methods, and that's how we teach, which is, there's a set of standardized things that we sort of go through in terms of quantitative and qualitative and certain key terms that we introduce, doing interviews and all those kind of things, right? But none of you seem to be. I mean, you do work with that, but there's also to create rather than creating a template for architecture research, what each of you seem to be doing is sort of creating a space, be it a lab or a studio for experiments, or a space for daydreaming and sort of following thoughts, or sort of snatching time, or sort of creating other kinds of epistemologies, or using different kind of either theoretical devices that you find in spaces, sort of create a space for research located within South Asia, right? So it's not necessary that we do have these kinds of templates to work with, and that's probably what you were talking about in terms of staying with the trouble of working with that, rather than what Kush is saying, to go back to questions of standards and universalities and norms that we follow in terms of research. But that also means that there's a lot more work that it requires, both in sort of devising research courses, but also research projects in that sense. Uh, uh, but also experimenting, I think, with sort of tools that students come up with, which we do in many ways, and which we've been seeing through all the presentations. But it does require a shift in how we sort of teach architecture research methods, right? In terms of the experiments, but also sort of moving away from questions of drawing to sort of thinking about embodied knowledges, to opening up other questions of epistemologies, thinking about devices from other epistemologies rather than just disciplines. So it's really sort of, creating your own research space for a project rather than, it might change with every project, but that's what seems to be emerging here, rather than thinking about maybe when I wrote the questions, I think I was thinking about like certain coordinates and parameters that one could list down and sort of work with, but it really seems that that one has to sort of set them up for oneself. Yeah. Uh, I'll open it up for every who's here.
Uh, okay, so I mean, I enjoyed the discussion a lot, but to start with, I mean, okay, so uh, while all of you talked about different ideas of research and ways of research and locating oneself within the idea of uh, an architectural research and the process of it. They, uh, Prasad mentioned that what happens is that what came through is that there are these research spaces that uh, these almost segregated research spaces that one creates because of the lack of a cohesive or a structured uh, presence or of a research space where one can be. Uh, there, I think, is where my first question lies is where, as a student, as a fifth year student, I wonder where do I find myself or where do I locate in this network where even if I want to enter the field of research, uh, there is no roadmap to it in a sense, or what came through is that there is uh, there is no specificity to what can be. And taking it forward, in the crisis that began the conversation, there is the idea of the there is the mention of the perceived gap between practice and pedagogy that is there. But then, if with this discussion we are trying to posit that research becomes the medium of connecting it, I mean, I think I'm unclear there of how does that happen, or how does that shift from of the educational or pedagogical space to an academia can help bridge this gap between practice and pedagogy. Because if we are saying that there are the ideas of experimenting with the research methodology, taking it back to the earlier conversation of theorizing, conversion of experiments to theorizing, creating new uh, knowledge and theory, architecture theory from it, that needs some sort of cohesion between a set of research that happens. So, which would uh, eventually inform the gap, I think. But uh, I mean, these two questions are something. I mean, I know it's not actually. Just take a couple of questions or two or three questions and then respond collectively.
So I wanted to say something on crisis of architecture and discipline in discipline. This is more like the tiny notes that I gathered over the course of 5 years, which were in conversations to my friends who are in different architectural colleges, studying the same age, and my classmates, and everything that we learned and like have experienced here in school. So, I mean, the idea that 90% of the population cannot access to architectural services and only 5% of the so back when we were in our internship courses, majority of my classmates and I as well were designing or like making buildings like these private residences for certain, which actually only caters to a certain class of people. And this class, I mean, and that is where it starts becoming the identity of the architect, that the architect only caters to a specific population. And on the contrary, what we actually learn at school is very much different from, like Vishwanath said, that the relation between architecture and society. And then, of course, Rupali, when she starts mentioning the idea, when she starts showing this Adivasi regions, or even Rohit when he shows these spaces, I mean, when we that connects to the colonial idea of permanence. So somewhere I feel when we went to work, I mean, I also personally felt like मुझे समझ ही नहीं आ रहा है why am I doing this in the first place when I haven't learned it this way. And like whatever, how long these architectural offices they require requirements are like certain skill sets, like how long does it take to learn certain computational skills. This is what I have experienced, like we have done it in weeks of 7 weeks or something, like you just tell us learn this and come and we do it. It's not that difficult. So somewhere it's like the rest of the 90% I feel is actually somewhere thinking that they cannot access these services because the kind of homes or the kind of structures that they inhabit cannot be validated because they grow, they like change over the period of time. And then there is this idea of technicalities that is taught in a majority of schools in Mumbai, at least as far as I know. So, I mean, I am really struggling that back, and that is where when we go out, we, I mean, I am struggling like whether should I work with them, like how do I engage with these people in the conversations?
So I'm kind of extending. Oh yeah, hi. I'm Isha, and I'm in the 5th year as well. So I'm extending from Rachit's question. So in the morning also we had like a discussion about descriptions or thick descriptions. So uh, this was the first time that all of us were also attempting at doing some sort of a research. But on our everyday basis, we do observe certain things that kind of stick to our stick in our mind and are interested in taking it forward in some way. So the first tool that we have is of descriptions or formulating some sort of descriptions. So my question will be like, at what point do these descriptions turn into some sort of a research, or what will be that point where we are taking these descriptions to a research question of sorts? And I have another question for Vishwanath specifically, because he was talking about experiments. And throughout the 5 years, we have constantly been talking about practice. And everybody in our school like emphasizes on having a practice of sorts, which is of a long duration, a long durée practice. So in that practice, all of us are making experiments which are really like small. So how do you distinguish between a practice and an experiment? Yeah.
Uh, I just have a small question. When we say practice, and Rajat also posed like practice against the educational space, and in the college we have also talked about practice and the educational space. But is it like, is the danger lies in that space when you start talking about practice is a different thing apart from the educational space or apart from the academia, or is it an extension of the educational space? Like, are these two different things, or should we start thinking of one as an extension of the other? Is
So I'll try to answer a couple of questions. But when we won't remember the questions. When we won't remember the questions. So I'll do a short answer to maybe Rachit's and Neha's. And Isha, what was the question that Isha had? See, I've already lost it now. Practice and experiment, right? Yeah, okay. So I think, and you're saying that how do we position ourselves in research and what do we know, what we have to research? I think, so I think we don't expect any of you to do the kind of research that we do, right? So that's kind of obvious, right? You can, so the point is that to develop your own research or your practice trajectory. And that's what I meant by always paying attention to what matters to you. There are a lot of things to care about, but you can't care about everything, and therefore being super select, and therefore then kind of and I suppose it kind of maybe connects with Kush's this comment on subjectivation. Yeah. So whether that's a troubling concept, it in a way is, but then if you make sense of yourself, things that you have an affinity with, you have a solidarity with, that travel with you always, and that you pay attention to that. And those are the things that matter. Those are the moments that matter. And that tells you the kind of research practitioner architect you will be. So you will develop your own unique trajectory. And that's why I always say it's always about trajectory. So it goes over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And it's about positioning yourself. And I think the comment about, the question about extension, I think it will always be an uncomfortable fit. I don't think it'll ever be an easy extension from academia to practice. So it's not an extension, but it is an extension, an uneasy fit. And I think it's about responding and staying attentive to what needs responding to as an architect and how you can respond it within the agency that you have as an architect. And I think Isha's question about how do they turn? They don't turn into theory, Isha. You will have to turn them into something. I think it's again that Prasad, you were talking about theoretical devices or frameworks. I think that if you have certain frameworks and you've done all this thick description, and then you say, well, what does it mean? And what does it mean, that statement you believe to be true? A theory is a statement you believe to be true. It's not a fact. The sky is blue, grass is green is not a theory, that's a fact. But a theory is something you believe to be true. And I may not believe it to be true, right? So that's there is that difference there. And I don't have to be convinced about it. You have to be convinced about it. So, and there is a role of evidence and, kind of theoretical frameworks that is there and that. But the kind of research you do, I think we're all committed to, climate emergency, but no, I don't expect that every student here will go and do a research in sustainability, right? So I think, again, my talk was really about then that whole point of finding yourself. So if I did a dissertation on legitimacy of architecture and then gender-aware design and then Ruskin and then aging, there's a thread that runs through it, that connects it, that makes sense. It's not random, it's not haphazard, it's not choppy, it just makes sense, and I'm comfortable with that. I could have researched high-tech urbanism, I could have done AI, but not comfortable with that because it doesn't fit in with my sense of self. That's not who I am. So I hope that helps a little bit to develop that sense of self and develop your own trajectory as a research practitioner. And I don't know how to answer your question. Somebody else can have a go.
Actually wanted to, Rajat, your question said, implied something about how do you enter the space of research, right? There was something about as if there's this, it's a location which is very kind of distant from you. But over the 2 days, what I've observed is all of you are already in that space of research. I mean, there's such tremendous, Rupali was mentioning the idea of joy and even likeness or love, and that comes through in all of your projects. So it's not that you're entering a space of research. Your works are already modeling the kind of research inquiries that you're building as a verb again. So it's not a destination to reach, but it's a practice in the sense of it being a verb, and enjoy that, inhabit that, and move with it and see how it grows with you in the context, whether it is a 6-month dissertation or in the context of how you travel with it moving forward. And yeah, as opposed to sort of seeing it as a distant reality.
Yeah, just to quickly respond to the question that you asked to me about the practice and these small experiments. I think it is also tied to some of the other questions, like Rachit's question about entering a research project. So I feel, firstly, I would like to distinguish between practice and architectural office. So if you are asking, does education prepare you for practice? is the question you're asking. So if you're asking, is education preparing you to go into an architectural office and design projects, it's a different question. So the same problem that happens with the idea of a project in architectural practice happens with research also. That's why people start thinking, okay, I have just graduated. There are hardly any offices where you can join as an architectural researcher. If I'm joining a mainstream office which is doing projects, then we start wondering, oh, we did all this research, where do I do research? So this idea of the project does disservice both to the idea of research and both to the idea of design or design of spaces. And in that sense, if we say that no, researching is an attitude or a way of thinking about things. So when you're asking, for example, when does description turn into research? When you are just talking about what you see, especially if you're talking of any phenomena, when you're asking what questions, till that time you're describing. The moment you start asking why, and that why is not, you are not able to see that why directly, you are shifting slowly from the what question to the why question. So even in a thick description, you're slowly beginning to move into the realm of research. And I think that even in design practices where people are designing buildings, and I'm sure in your other studios where you're doing projects, there were case studies or there was some research that you did in the beginning, right? So in that sense, there are very few offices which, when they get a design project, they go through a very conscious phase of doing research for that project as an embedded part of the design process. Uh, but I think if you develop an attitude to do research, which has a certain criticality to it, and an attitude to design which has a certain creative angle to it, then you'll find your own spaces. So I think that to expect that after you graduate you will get a research project or even a design project is asking for too much too soon. So to me it's like a 10-year project. But what one should not forget is, if your goal is that after 10 years I want to do pure research, or I want to have a practice where I'm designing buildings, what is those small incremental steps of every day that you do which will let you end up in that position 10 years from now? That has to be carefully thought of. So we are looking for immediate sort of pure avenues for doing research or doing design projects. And when we don't find that, we just let go of everything and we say, okay, we'll just work in an office till we get a client for whom we can design, and that will be our first design project. So I think the idea of nudging slowly towards uh, being able to do projects, whether it is research or design, is something that you should be conscious of in your journey.
Hello, hi. Uh, my question is directly to you. It's a small question. So this method of experimentation and these experiments that you carry out in your studio, these are very much a part of your own practice as a teacher. And but my question is, where do the students here come in apart from, or where do they actually participate apart from being a part of the studio and producing work that is later analyzed? Can they become, like, can they actually participate in the experiment itself, and then maybe the experiment itself shifts in a certain way?
A very pertinent question, I would say. I would say that in many of the experiments, the students are involuntary participants, or rather case studies in doing research. There are just two instances where students were actually doing the research, or were participating in the research design also. So in the first 2008 curriculum revision we did, uh, each faculty along with 20 students formed a group, and in a 2-day workshop, they all designed curriculum. So at the end of a 2-day workshop, there were 8 curriculum designs that were done. So I recollect that that was one instance where students were actively engaged even in designing that experiment. Uh, I wish there could be more instances of this. But in the undergraduate courses I take, there hasn't been any instance where students are part of the experiment design. But maybe now that you're asking it, I'll think about it, and I'll think of how to design an experiment where students are also not just participants. Sorry. Uh, yeah, they are part of the experiment. They're just not the people who have designed the co-designed the experiment. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I was just thinking of the question that Isha asked, and Isha, I was wondering if one might like to pose it a little differently. Rather than asking the question, when does description become research, one might ask, what script does how does the description script space, right? And the description is a script or a conscript of space. So what kind of script or conscript of space does it produce? So when when I was kind of drawing, when I was talking about the stories that are kind of small vignettes, I mean, just again connecting to the question that Prasad asked all of us, was what are you struggling with? And I think of it in terms of asking opposite kind of questions. What map does the text write? Or what drawing does it construct? What is the map of space that that the text constructs? And what script does the drawing draw? So if we can start also asking opposite kinds of questions, then one is getting at a script or a conscript of space. And if the act of design starts in the act of thinking about or drawing out maps, that's where the research then gets also located.
Hello. Yeah, okay. Neha, right? Yeah, Neha, to your question that, yes, thank you for sharing in very candid ways that you are sort of worried and troubled by the fact that how do you take this work forward as you're graduating, and what are the opportunities and avenues out there? And I think that's a question that we all, at least those of us who are inhabiting the academy, need to ask, right? And something that Rupali and I have been in conversation as well, that students really make use of these 5 years, develop certain capacities, but then there's a sharp departure, or at least a sense of a disruption that one encounters when that kind of a community or that kind of a collectivist orientation to critical inquiry building work is not immediately felt. And so I'm thinking then more reflectively, what is the responsibility of an academic institution or a program to, start looking at its form and nature in a much more, if a decentered way, or in much more democratized way, or in a much more collectivist way, and in much more sort of beyond the boundary confines of the curriculum or the institution itself. And I think it's, for example, the lab that I run, what does it mean to run a lab which is not just a lab in the institution, but it is with the institution? And then it allows other kinds of tentacles to really, really be part of the city, or the neighborhood or the district, so that graduates, not just from the school, but any and every graduate who are aligning themselves with the kind of work that's happening in a particular center get to then sort of continue to build their capacities and be part of the larger project making as it happens in real time. So, yeah.
Very quickly kind of respond to both Rachit and Neha, in the sense that, I mean, I'll just come back to this idea of thinking of research as a form of life, because then there is no roadmap as such where something is out there, like, right? You're designing your life as well as, designing your life with others. And so then what are the tools that you build for yourself where you're able to participate and also have conversations, right, where you create agency for yourself but also bring others into your project together, right? And this is where we'll also kind of teach you, I mean, right from the first year we consider you as peers, right? And that's where you have to learn to break those hierarchies as well, right? You're not somebody who's like this person in an office who's, is sitting and producing something for someone else, but what are the dialogues that you're able to create, as well? What are the agencies, like what are your own agencies where you are able to bring in some of these questions into other worlds, yeah, which may not be insular worlds like these. I mean, I just, when this symposium, I have this broadcast list of 500 people which I sent to, and I got a message from Bijoy Ramchandran, and he's like, why don't you invite architects to your panels as well? I mean, these are all, I know they're all architects, but in the sense that these are like people who are not only in academia but other practitioners as well. And I think that's what is, I mean, that's what is interesting, that it's not that people are, everybody's asking questions. And again, like going back to Rohit's, not working with binaries, I mean, that's what it's not like one is an architect and one is a practitioner. We are all, which is where the question of practice comes in. We're all practitioners, right? So how do you draw in this discourse, right? And not be frustrated by, of course there will be other like there will be things that certain projects or produce, there are exigencies, and so, but how do you create a dialogue which is larger with someone else? And that's the capacity that the school will build for you for 5 years. After that, how you what kind of capacities that you build to engage with the world is up to you. And there are lots of possibilities, yeah, but that confidence is something that the school will produce for you, yeah, which is why I think there's no one road map ki, oh, there is that one thing. Stay with the trouble, stay with the forest, stay with the imagination, and you'll find those road maps.
I just want to make a short comment. Sorry, I forgot your name from yesterday with Rachin. And I think and Isha's question about theory making, theory building, I think there's an element of bravery that is required. I think you all have to embrace that. You really have to go out on a limb, stick your neck out, and say, I believe, not that this is my opinion, but I've done all of this, and therefore, and it's an act of bravery. I mean, that's what I've experienced in my life. To say things to, and a lot of us publish, and a lot of us sometimes will get that feedback. Are you mad? Did you really say this? So it's not. I think being researchers, architectural researchers in general, comes with an. I mean, it has to. You have to have that element of bravery. So if I was doing your project, it just annoyed me to no extent. The work, not your work, but just the whole kind of setup. It is like, I can already think of, if I had to write it and say, I would say that domestic rituals, or the methodologies and epistemologies of food is what is producing these oppressive spatial systems. And I'm like, and you're like, what? Okay, so there is a way to word it, and it may not be the sophisticated in the first instance, and then you refine it and you refine it and refine it, but to not say it. And that's what I meant, is to be really bold and to really challenge convention, because you've internalized, there's a system in which we've internalized a lot of things, and say, I can't really say that. That doesn't make sense. How can that be? This is how, this is it. This, I've inherited this, I've received this. So it's all good. Everybody told me this is good, I'm loved, and everything is wonderful in my life. No, well, actually it's not. And so being a researcher or a good researcher or a continuous researcher needs an act of bravery where you need to say something, and maybe it's not random thought because you've done the work. So you need to say something, and it's like the first version is not going to be great, but the fifth or the sixth or the 10th version is going to be great. So it doesn't turn itself. You have to make an effort and again, a lot of even PhD students ask this question. So if I read 100 books, I'll see the research gap. I'm like, no, you won't. This doesn't work like that. It's so much more chemical. It's so much more situated. It's so much within you. If I read the same 100 books as you will come up with a different research topic, and I'll come up with a different research gap. I'm telling you that 100%. So research is so much more unscientific. It's so, it's systematic, but it's not scientific. It's not like if I add 100 things, I'm going to get 101. It's not like that. So, but it needs an element of boldness. I call that intuition. It's a very unfashionable word, but I call it the research intuition. It's not like just dreaming up things in your head, but I've read it and I know something. So it's being aware of your own knowledge, having done that work. I hope that helps, because that's kind of the struggle that I've experienced for 2 days, kind of seeing you struggle with that you've presented your work, but you're not taking that next step and say, I think, thank you.
There is this thing that the academia year na it becomes it's perceived as a preparatory thing. It prepares you for the outside. Means right now I'm inside. I'm not inside. I'm also outside. Now that's the thing actually. That okay, like see, for 10 years you're learning mathematics. Yeah, architecture you learn only for 5 years now. So now 10 years, so you should try to become a mathematician. And the problem is there actually, and most of what your parents must have learned, they must be not practicing that. And they must have got some degree from somewhere, but they're doing something else. Why is this kind of there is a push that this particular course or the engineers, most engineers in India don't do engineering. They're derivative finance. Most of them. Not derivative finance. It's kind of so architects पर मैं बाहर जाके क्या करूँगी? खाना पकाओ. मतलब अच्छा लगता तो वो करो. The thing I'll tell you why. See, the thing is that your practice has already started. You don't realize it. It's already there. It's already started. Recognize that. It's very important to recognize that. You're already asking questions. You're already kind of growing in a certain way from wherever you are, you know. And that, how do you kind of further that, take the next step? उसमें projects होंगे, उसमें ये होगा ही, but that, see, there is a way in which the political economy kind of forces you to think of academia as a preparatory, place. It's not a preparatory place. We are not doing chartes coaching class. We're not doing that. No, we kind of we're it's not a preparatory place. It's kind of, you come here, you are working things out. We are working things out with you. It's like a there is a commitment and promise that we will build capacity in you to do certain things. All of those things are there, but it's not. We don't think of it as a preparatory thing. That's a problem. You're already kind of into practice. You're already practicing. Now, how do you kind of push it further? How do you kind of work that out? Where does it move ahead? That's, I think that's the way to kind of go about it.
So my question is to all of you. Like Vishwanath and Rupali, you all mentioned that drawing as a tool. Tools are supposed to be useful and moreover generic. But if those tools complicate something, it could turn out to be useless. All the efforts and time, all in vain. So, for example, talking about all the presentations, specifically about Saili, Yash, and I, when we presented, it it was not as literal because we added our own symbols, our own way of looking towards the space as compared to others like Prajwal or people who have made detailed drawings of spaces which could be read for anybody, like um, without any effort, sort of. I'm not saying that he didn't make any effort. It was so. The question is, what level of literacy or readability a research should hold so that a layman or people in the same field could relate to it. It is not just about convincing someone, but at the end, it should be able to convey the idea to many so that it brings in a change or changing the standard methods of looking at something.
Uh, well, I think so. Firstly, it depends highly on whether you're using drawing one as a tool or a medium. That's one whole discussion. But even if you're using it as a tool, uh, what is the purpose that you're using it for? Because we use drawings to understand situations. We use drawings to imagine things that are not built or don't exist. We might also be using drawings to communicate something to someone else. So when you're making these drawings, I think the question is, are these drawings made for the presentation, or were these drawings part of the process of doing research? Did this drawing help you understand phenomena, or was that some other scribble in your sketchbook and the drawing you're presenting in the thesis is to communicate some idea to someone else? If the drawing is purely a communication tool, then what you're saying holds true, that the other person should make the same meaning, fairly similar meaning as what you intend. If that is not happening, then the tool is, you're using the incorrect tool. But and I think that's the also the question that came up when I think Anuradha was asking in your case, that could you talk about the performance of the drawing itself, in the sense that imagine if you had made that scroll while you were walking. Every day you make one panel, you don't know what will happen in the next panel, versus you did the whole journey, you came back and you made the panel. Now these two are two very different performances of the act of drawing. Now here the act of drawing is a medium to understand that phenomena. It's not a tool of communication. Whereas when you put it here, you are trying to use the drawing to communicate something to us. So I think when it comes to a tool, I would say that no tool is good or bad. It's the appropriateness of the tool for the purpose which makes it good or bad.
I just again, I think I'll just go to the idea of drawing that Michael Taussig talks about. He talks about the idea of drawing as drawing out. You know, you're not, so drawing is often seen as a tool for communication, like Vishwanath is saying, but it may not be. It may be a way of making sense of the world. You know, and so what is that sense of the world that one is trying to, you know, what is it that you're drawing out? You know, and so if you're invested in that, then there can be many roles, because it opens up new imaginations for you. You know, a particular way of drawing, and that's what, like when we were I think we've given this there's a several times this example of 2 minutes. Are you showing me 2 minutes? Okay. You know, like when we were looking, we were in Jaipur, for example, we were looking at what drawings have produced the buildings around in Jaipur, and there were no drawings, like there were no orthographic drawings, but they had produced the most sophisticated buildings, right? And then when we saw in the city archives that these drawings were really kind of small, they were sketch notes, they were miniature paintings where plans and sections and elevations were mixed up. There were notes like so much mal, you know, there were notes, almost like working drawing notes of, saying that this much money has to be given to so and so, right? And so these were scripts. These were scripts where people would add to. So one person may, if I give you the drawing, I may not be able to produce the building from that one drawing, but then there is a thing that gets added and added and added. You draw out something from it, you drop something back into it. So it's a way of sensing and knowing the world, right? So I think that is something, and how much successful are you, or in that. That I think is a better metric than talking about how much it is communicated to the world. Like there was in the Chicago Biennial right now, there was a theater for one, so it's not about like an audience that you're building. And when you're talking about lay person, who's a lay person? There is nothing like a lay person. I think then you're kind of dumbing things down when you say that there is something like a lay person, right? Then we fall into standards, and then we fall into these are traps. They're templates and standards, and these are traps then that reduce the way of knowing the world and also acting in it. Yeah.
Because Rupali mentioned the word world. No, I think because let's just one point. Like when you're drawing like you're not trying to understand. You are making the world. You're making yourself, but you're making the world. And then how do you want to make that world? Na? It's a very interesting thing. Na? It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting instrument. Na? You're making the world. So not trying to understand, not produce it. Like you cannot. Like world is there. What you make? Now you're making the world for you. Now how do you think through that?
Okay. Last question.
It's not a question.
We have
Uh,
exactly
so,
half a minute.
I had worked with Girish Doshi, and he is a person whom all the architects come to speak to and spend time with, because they are very fascinated uh, about his practice. And people say that he actually does riyaz when he designs. So throughout his years, he has set up, like he has understood space and the comfort levels of space and sizes of the spaces, and he takes one plan of his previous building, and he works with the same spaces, and uh, then he tries to work around his proportions and understood scales. And this is something that people really come to him for. Like people think that like the musicians have riyaz, they keep practicing with the same notes and they make music. Similarly, he has his practice where he studies the scales and proportions, and accordingly he just carries it forward throughout his projects. So that's it.
Okay. No, I mean, it's also, I think I'm not pushing because I think it's like this is the time that when they have a space to ask questions that, they've been struggling with for a while. So we'll stop. Thanks a lot to all the speakers. Thanks a lot to everyone who's listening online, but also for all of you to sort of sit through and think about these things with us. So I'll thank you, and we'll end this. I think this requires a very different kind of format. It has to start at 8 in the morning and we go till 5. And have food and tea and all. Yeah, yeah. And have other, yeah. Okay, so thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8:30.